Okay, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to today's meeting of Planning Committee A. I'm Councillor Johnny Crawshaw, and I'm the chair of this committee. On my right is Becky Eads, who's the head of Planning and Development Services. To the right of her is Jonathan Kenyon, who is the Principal Planning Officer. And to the right of him is Guy Hanson, who is the Design and Conservation Manager. On my left is Ange Bealby, who is from Democratic Services, and to the left of Ange is Sandra Brannigan, who's the senior lawyer. Down either side of the tables are the members of the committee. Bit of housekeeping before we get started. We're not expecting a fire alarm today, so if the alarms do go off, we'll vacate the building by the nearest exit, and for anybody not familiar with the building, we'll guide you out. There are toilets through the door behind me. Members of the public can use those toilets during the session, but committee members can't leave during the determination today, so we may well take some adjournments depending on how we're going along. And committee members, if I can just remind you when you're speaking to make sure that you're speaking directly into the microphones. The acoustics in this room aren't fantastic, and there will be people watching online. So as much as you can, have the microphone close to you and speak clearly, please. In terms of how today's meeting will run, this is a business meeting of the council that's held in public, not a public meeting per se. So there is a very defined section where we have public participation. And if I can ask anybody who's present in the room outside of those defined periods, please don't try to contact or pass information to any members of the committee during the hearing. As I say, we will likely need to take some adjournments during the course of today's meeting. During those adjournments, again, please don't try to interact with any members of the committee, and members of the committee are reminded that during an adjournment, we're not to discuss anything to do with the application. Everything that we discuss needs to be done in public in clear view of everybody. We've only got one item on the agenda today as such. There are actually two applications. There's an application and a listed building consent, which is related to the application. My intention is that we take both things together as one, although we will need to take two votes at the end of the meeting. And in terms of how that process will happen, for the benefit of anybody who hasn't seen one of these meetings previously, in a few minutes, I'll invite the officers to talk through the plans that are before us. I'll then invite committee members to ask any questions of clarity on those plans. I'll then invite the officers to give us any updates that there have been since the report was published. And then we go to public participation. There are a number of people registered to speak at today's meeting, so I'll invite them to come in turn to address the committee. And anybody who is speaking, if you just stay put once you've finished your 3 minutes, and I'll invite the committee members if they have any questions that they wish to ask of you. Once we've done the public participation, we move to members' questions of officers on the report and anything that may have been brought up during the public participation. Once we've got all of the information that we need, we then move into debate. That's the opportunity for members to discuss the application and any thoughts or considerations that they have. And then we move to considering the officer's recommendation. Once we've considered the officer's recommendation, if the committee is not minded to agree with it, I'll invite people to make any alternative recommendation or suggestion, but we will test or consider the officer recommendation as the first thing that we do. So hopefully that all makes sense. And as I say, as we go through, I will try to keep us all on track so we all know where we are within the process. Before we begin the meeting formally as well, I just want to remind members that our role as committee is not to scrutinise every last detail of the schemes that are put before us. It's to consider the planning issues that are set out within the report and then to come to a decision based on that report. The reports that we receive will contain summary positions from a range of contributors, and those contributors will have had detailed and lengthy discussions before arriving at their position. Likewise, any responses that you receive from the officers present today will constitute a judgment based on a professional qualifications, knowledge and experience. So my intention in saying that is not in any way to inhibit debate or questioning or any of that sort of thing, but I just want us to have that in mind when we're thinking about how we're determining this application. And again, I will just remind you that when we are putting questions, whether it's to members of the public or whether it's to officers, those must be questions that are planning related. And as I say, we do just have to think is this line of questioning going to materially impact our overall decision on the planning balance? So with all of those things said, I'll move us on to the formal agenda. So agenda item 1 is apologies and absences. I've received one apology from Councillor Wan, and Councillor Wan is being substituted by Councillor Fenton today. Item 2 is declarations of interest. So if I can invite any members who have anything that they wish to declare in relation to today's meeting. I'm not seeing any hands, so I'll take that as there not being any. So item 3 then is minutes of previous meetings. We have 3 sets of minutes that we need to approve. So the first set of minutes is on page 3 from the 1st of August. Is everybody happy that they're a reasonable, an accurate record? All happy with those? The second set is page 9, also from the 1st of August. Again, everybody happy that they're a true representation? And the final set on page 17 from the 5th of September. Again, I've got a couple of hands, so I saw Councillor Melly first.
Thank you, Chair. Just a really minor point of accuracy. In minute 118, the first sentence of it says it was resolved that the minutes of the last meeting were approved as an accurate record, but it wasn't the last meeting that we approved then, it was July's minutes. So I think we just need to delete the word last.
Yeah, I think that's fair enough. And Councillor Fisher.
Very minor one on page 24, the first bullet point. It says the separation distances between Forge and Saddlers Closes was 2 metres. It should say the separation distances between Forge and Saddlers Closes and the development was 21 metres. I checked that was what was actually said.
Yeah,
very tiny, but
yeah, no, I think that's fair as well. So with those 2 minor amendments, are we all happy that they're to be approved? Okay, thank you very much. So I can then move us on to agenda item 4, which is the general remit public participation. We don't have anybody registered today under the general remit, which means I can move us straight on to agenda items 5A and 5B. So this is to determine the site of 19 to 33 Coney Street, York. And as I mentioned previously, there's a major full application, and then there's a listed building consent application. And my intention is we take the both together. I'll be happy to take questions when we get to the appropriate points on either of the reports. And then at the end of the meeting, we'll take 2 votes on the 2 different elements. So if I can pass over to Becky, or we're going straight to Jonathan. Jonathan, to talk us through the plans, please.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair. So this is the application, the 2 reference numbers. The scheme is for redevelopment of 19 to 33, land to the rear of 35 to 37, and 39 Coney Street to Spurrier Gate. Conversion of retained buildings, new build elements that are 3 to 6 stories high to create Class C use and purpose-built student accommodation. The scheme also includes public realm works, including the Riverside Walkway, landscaping and access, and the details there of the listed building consent that's associated. So this is the application site plan. You have zone 2, which is number 19 Coney Street. That building is to be converted, and then zone 3 is a group of listed and 1 unlisted building and a building of merit. And there's some modern, that's where there's a modern extension from the 20th century at the back that's proposed to be demolished. And then there's a gap in the street where there's buildings outside of the application site. And then finally zone 4, which is the WH Smith building and Boots buildings at the moment. The Boots one would be demolished, and the extension at the back of the Smiths one would be demolished. This is an aerial view to hopefully give you a better understanding. So to work your way through, this one is number 19, which is zone 2. And then the next section, as I mentioned, with the new builds at the back to be demolished. And then the large buildings at this end, WH Smith's here and the Boots building here. This is the proposed elevation fronting onto Coney Street. So again, working away south, number 19, which has been refurbished and restored. And then the group of buildings in zone 2. So this one it's a building of merit. And we've got 2 listed buildings. This is a building that's been to be demolished and replaced, that's unlisted, and another listed building. Then we're outside of the site, and then this is a proposed Coney Street elevation. So the section in white is the existing WH Smith buildings, and then moving on, that's the proposed replacement for the Boots building. And then finally, the new proposed Waterloo Place that leads down to the riverside. It's just a closer up iteration of the elevation for zones 2 and 3, even closer. These are the existing elevations, so that highlighted there, that's the unlisted building where it's proposed for demolition, and there's a new building replacement. Just to sort of skip between, you can see that that's the proposed. The massing is comparable. There's just an extra floor in the roof, so the eaves and the ridge are a little higher, and this would be a new passageway that would lead through to an internal courtyard that would have commercial uses facing onto it. It's a proposed elevation, sorry, that's the existing elevation of zone 4, so that's the WH Smith building, and then this is the Boots that's proposed for demolition, unlisted. There's another, so that's the proposed elevation. Show that again in replacement of that one. So that's going from existing to proposed, and this is the new build. So it's 3 and 4 story immediately against Coney Street. The slightly lighter section is because those sections are further back within the site. This next drawing shows you an idea of the architectural detailing on the proposed buildings. So it shows us the modelling and articulation of the new shop fronts and the windows and the materiality. And that's a copper roof that would be on the new building, which replaces the Boots building. This is the proposed riverside elevation, so that's from the opposite side of the river. This is a closer up version of that. So we've got again, that's zone 2, that's the existing back of 19 Coney Street that's refurbished and gets new windows. This is the proposed new section that would replace the low-lying buildings at the moment and the trees that are there currently. So that's a mixture of 5 stories there, 3 stories in this section. You've got the river walkway consistently along the riverside, so that would vary. So number 19, it extends right to the river's edge at the moment, so the walkway would sort of cantilever out in front of that in a similar way it does to at the city screen at the moment. And then at this extent of the site, there'd be a continuation of the river wall, and the buildings are set further back. And this is zone 4, so that's the area that's the back of WH Smith's at the moment. This is a section that would replace the back of the Boots building. So that's 6 story, and then that's the new Waterloo Place. Similar to the previous, that's some detailed elevations, which again shows the articulation and the materials and details of how the shop fronts would work. This is an elevation fronting onto the new proposed Waterloo Place. There have been amendments to this corner elevation on the corner with Coney Street and Waterloo Place that have been revised to address consultation responses received from the amenity societies and heritage consultees during the process. So we've got new shop fronts fronting onto Waterloo Place. It also shows the variation we have in ground levels between Coney Street and how it slopes down to the river. So when I go on to show you the floor plans, we have these sort of lower ground floor plans that are sort of underneath Coney Street, where you've got back of house equipment, but then when you're down at the riverside, that's a level that faces onto the river walkway. You can see the staircase down there, but as we'll show you on a later slide, there's also there's a ramp, there's a level access that works its way down to deal with those changing levels as well. again, details of the elevations and the materials for that elevation on Waterloo Place. Floor plans. So this is the lower ground floor plans for zones 2 and 3. So this section here is number 19. So you've got retail facing Coney Street. That's ancillary space for the sort of amenity space for the student accommodation on that element of the river. And this is the zone 3 group of buildings. So you can see you've got new commercial leisure units facing onto the river walkway there. So this is the ground floor. So that's zone 2 existing retail floor plate. This is zone 3. So you can see in here how different buildings are subdivided. Then we've got this courtyard area that in turn leads down to the river walkway through there, and student accommodation and a commercial use fronting the riverside. And then we've got various upper floor plans which show the student accommodation and some of the amenity space. So that's communal amenity space, and there are other amenity spaces dotted around the accommodation. It's also a mixture of studio type units and clusters which have got shared living and dining facilities. So further floor plans. And the roof plan is a proposal for got PV panels on the roof of 19, and this is this would be an amenity space for the residents as well. These are the plans for zone 4. So again, lower ground floor. So beneath ground level at Coney Street, you've got the back of house, bin storage, cycle storage. That's accessed via lifts. And then down at the Riverside Walkway, commercial leisure uses and ground floor level. So it's retail at the front, commercial at the back, and just goes through the different floor plans. There's a sort of courtyard at the upper floor level that the apartments are arranged around. It's a roof plan. This drawing shows the different typical layouts. So these show that the layouts and arrangements are fit for purpose and of appropriate scale. So we've got standard rooms and rooms that are accessible as well are also shown on there. So they've all been shown that they meet all the spatial requirements and they're functional and appropriate. This is the plans for the public realm. So this shows the design for Waterloo Place. That zigzag sort of line shows how the ramp deals with the change in levels, provides access down to the Riverside Walkway. This is the courtyard I mentioned before. So you've got some retail units that would face onto that. And there'd be a new route through, which would be sort of punched through that, as I mentioned, that building there at the moment that's not listed. This shows the existing situation. So that's number 19. This is zone 3, existing buildings that to be replaced. You can see the historic buildings facing Coney Street in the backdrop there. This one is the back of the W.H. Smith building. That's the back of the Boots building that's hard up to the river. This is from the opposite direction from Ousbridge. So the site essentially, it starts here. That's the Boots building, and it goes up to the number 19, which is the white building there. These are views from Coney Street. So this is Boots building proposed for demolition. That's looking, I think that's Market Street. Is it Market Street? Looking down towards the, oh yeah, it says on the top left. Yeah. Looking towards the Boots building. This is the opposite end of the site. So that's number 19. Shopfront would be updated as a consequence of the scheme. All the windows would be replaced and upgraded. That's a building of merit in the conservation area appraisal. It's not listed. These are the aerial views that help interpret the scheme. So this shows zone 2 and zone 3, and you can appreciate the gap that's created via the demolition, and it reveals the rear elevations of the historic buildings there. And then this is the new build fronting onto the river. This shaded out is the gap that's outside of the application site. And this is the perspective from the other side. So this is looking at New Waterloo Place, the building that replaces the Boots building, and the building that replaces the Smiths building. And again, the frontage building, the W.H. Smith building is listed, and the historic buildings at the front are retained, and the rear elevation is better revealed by creation of that internal light welling courtyard area. This is a sort of view looking towards this Coney Street, Riverside, and this is the extent of the Boots building in Waterloo Place. And again, you can see the gap between the frontage buildings in zone 3 and the new build at the back. So just there's a couple of photo montages that give you an idea of what those replacement views would look like. So this is the proposed building replacing the Boots building, extending to existing number 19. That's another perspective from Ouse Bridge. So again, new build, it starts here and extends to number 19 here. And that's a perspective of Waterloo Place. And that's the end.
Right, thank you very much for that. So obviously there's quite a lot of information to take in there. What I'm going to do is just invite questions on points of clarification around the plans at the moment. So if you want to know, what a little bit is, or a further explanation of how something's laid out, I think probably the simplest way of doing this is I'll invite open questions, but if we're on a screen and you also have a question that's relating to that particular diagram or that particular aspect, if you can kind of indicate that to me, I'll try to bring people in so we're not kind of constantly jumping around. Hopefully that makes sense. And if you've indicated, I'll note your names down, so I will always come back to my original list of questions, even if we end up taking 1 or 2 people in advance of where you were. So if I can see any indications by show of hands, Councillor Whitcroft, I've seen you first, so on you go.
Thanks, Chair. Thanks, Jonathan. Could we just go back to the proposed rear elevation, or I guess the Riverside elevation? It's a great one, haven't I? There we are. So just on those railings that go along, presumably along right next to the river, how high are those railings going to be? And are they going to be consistent across the whole of the frontage? Sorry?
Hello, sorry, Guy Hanson. The matter would be agreed through a landscape condition, which would include boundary treatment. So they're sort of indicatively drawn at the moment, but we would ensure they were safe and suitable so that people were protected from the river edge.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, had Councillor Eyre next.
Thank you, Chair. I feel bad now because you skipped all the way to the beginning and I wanted to ask a question about the one at the end. Is that section about that's not in the application thing that looked on the sort of last 2 things like a big hole in the Riverside Walk? Is that a diagrammatic? Because it's included within the, or is it? If you keep going all the way through to sort of visuals at the end, which I appreciate are just visuals, it just looks like there's a big. If we keep going all the way to the end, if you say the second to last one, I think it was. Slides. That's so that bit. Then the next one, it looks as if it's sort of like dropped into the. So at the moment, would that just be, that would not be part of the development site? The river walkway would stop at one side and stop at the other side. And then the one towards the end had it as like a
So
big hole.
the
There, that's like a big hole. Like somebody's just sort of cut a section of the riverside walkway out. Yeah.
I think that's it. In terms of the drawings that people have been asked to approve, that for the river walkway, the piece of land that's outside of the applicant's ownership is included. It's in the site plan and it's included. It's shown as part of the scheme in the landscape plan. So you would be approving the entirety of the riverside walkway, including the piece that's outside of their ownership. But there's a phasing plan that we've got that's clear that that piece that isn't in their ownership is a later phase. So because the development's phased, it would allow it to come forward in phases without that. So you'd be approving it, but you wouldn't have guarantees it's being delivered as part of the application until.
But it would be
they get
level
through.
like that, not a huge hole cut out
Yeah,
of the.
it would be as per there's the landscape general arrangement drawing that's somewhere in here, that shows it all at the same grade and included.
When we do these presentations, I say photo montages are exactly that. Make your decision based on the plans, not on the photo montages.
So if they didn't acquire that land, it would basically be fenced off between that bit and that bit.
Yeah, sorry, this because of the size of the files, it's taking ages for the thing to flick, for the presentation to flick through.
I think the key point though is that it would be left safe. And so in terms of the determination, it's the application is within the boundary that it's in terms of the delivery, that would come forward in due course, presumably, but in the meantime, it would be we're not going to have a chasm at the edge of the river. Okay, Councillor Burton.
Just supplementary to that, would that mean then that it would be like a dead end? So the walkway would finish there, and to get back to the street, how would you get back up to the street? Go back, or would there be an alleyway through?
You'd have to go back the way you came.
Right.
Okay, looking for further indications of questions on the plans at the moment. Councillor Melly.
Thank you. I had some questions about the details of some of the plans of the layout of the purpose-built student accommodation. Because the layout of the rooms and the size of the rooms is quite clear. And then there's just quite a few other rooms like that are labelled things like living/kitchen and cluster and communal amenity. Is it in these plans, which in the report it mentions things like cinema rooms and study space and stuff, is the detail of what will be what left till later, or is it in these plans?
Well, we have a planning condition that says that if their areas are marked up for those types of communal amenity space, they have to remain in that use for perpetuity. But we don't. I think we'd leave it up to the operator as to whether they wanted to use it for study or entertainment kind of thing. We've always left that more up to the operator to make that choice. We feel the important bit is making sure it is a communal space and it's not converted into another bedroom, essentially.
So I think just for clarity on that, I know there's a couple of spaces that are marked as living/kitchen, and because I think I asked this question during a briefing. My understanding is that as a planning authority, we understand those spaces to be communal spaces, and it's that there are then bedrooms that some of which have kitchen facilities within them, but that there are communal spaces dotted throughout all of the development.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you. Councillor Colwick.
Thank you, Chair. Would I be correct in assuming that all of the public realm, which is accessible, is at ground level? There's no accessible public space at any other level, or is that the case?
Yeah, so so that one. So with this one, so that the top section is zone 3 where the courtyard is. So if you were to be moving from Coney Street into that courtyard, that's level, but then there's a change of level to go down to the riverside. So you can, it's showing steps there. So there's a lift that sits next to those steps. So if you're moving from the courtyard down to the riverside, that gradient has to be dealt with by a lift because of its distance. And then on zone 4, where you've got Waterloo Place, that's all got what we would call level access, I presume, because it's got a ramp at an appropriate gradient that provides access between the 2 levels.
If you got supplementary.
Only to be clear, so there's no public access to any of the areas that are at height. That will be entirely the residents.
I think yes, it's just that it's a tricky. So when we were going through the floor plans, the one that sort of shows level 0 is like the riverside elevation, and then you've got level 1, which is sort of Coney Street level. So within those 2 levels, that's where you've got the sort of commercial and retail space. But once we get above that, that's the private student accommodation. So that I'm not assuming any public access to that. So I guess so like when I showed number 19 and the amenity space on the roof, I think that's for use in association with the student accommodation. I'm not aware it's anticipated that that's a public accessible area. That's my understanding.
Okay, and Councillor Clark, I think you had something to mention on that.
Thanks, Chair. It's just a point of clarification, because we mentioned about the bit that's missing and that we'd have to go back if that wasn't delivered at a later stage. Can I just clarify that the other side of it, which is clearly marked there, is connected to what I think is actually the walkway of picture and piano, not city screen as mentioned earlier, but picture and piano, and that it would be accessible that way, as opposed to being completely a sort of island where you wouldn't actually be able to access it as a member of the public.
Where the picture and piano is at the moment, yes, that would continue in front of number 19, and then it would step in and join the new walkway that's set away from the riverside, if you like.
Yep, thank you.
I'm going to just jump in while you're on that screen as well, because I think this is probably as good a place to ask as any. The visualizations of the Waterloo Place show what looks to be like a living wall all the way up the side of number 4 Spurrier Gate and all the way up. I just wanted to check whether or not the treatment of that wall comes as part of the landscaping plan, or whether that's something that's entirely within the gift of the owners of those buildings, given that the boundary line of the plan is along what essentially becomes that living wall.
We do have a planning condition to deal with that entire elevation following the demolition. So I think not 100% sure what we'll find and what condition it will be in. So there's a condition of that to deal with that different treatment. That's all I can say really.
So I suppose what I'm asking is the treatment of that wall managed by the planning conditions that we have, and your answer is yes, it is. That's yeah. Okay, that's great. Thank you. Further questions, or are we satisfied? Councillor Melly, you look like you.
The files are so big it won't load, you know. You mean that?
Yeah, that would probably be it.
That.
That's
it.
the view I was thinking of. Okay, we're all happy. Any further questions on specifics of the plans, or you're all satisfied that you know what we're going to be considering? not seeing hands, so I'm happy that we're happy where we are for the minute. There will potentially be opportunity to go back if something else comes up that we need to have clarification on. So next, if I can just invite Jonathan to give us any update. I think there's one or two on the report.
Yeah, thank you. So the update's been circulated. Firstly, there's some corrections to the committee report. In paragraph 1.7, it refers to the height of the buildings facing the riverside and that they'll be 3 to 5 story, but that's incorrect because zone 4 is 6 story fronting the riverside. It's correct everywhere else in the report, just in paragraph 1.7 where it's wrong. On the update, we've clarified for members the amounts of development in each phase. So we've set out how many student rooms in each zone, and also a correction to the floor space provided by the commercial units. It's more than what was put in the report. That the figure in the report was from a superseded plan. So the scheme does involve 4,275 square meters commercial floor space, which is not included in the back of house areas. Another correction is in paragraph 5.19, where we've explained what weight you should give to the economy and housing delivery in the decision making, and it's just to specify the MPPF reference. It should say should. The MPPF says you should do things. It doesn't say you have to do things. So it's just to clarify that. And there's a correction to condition 30, which has a compliance element about how wide the lift doors need to be, where they're required for access for bins and cycles. And we're just asking to change that from 1.3 meters to 1.2 meters. It's shown as 1.2 on the plans, and it only needs to be 1.2. So that's what the condition would say. And then finally, just a bit extra on the viability review in 5.60. It's just to say, in terms of, we've set some information out as to how that review, the procedures we'd follow in that respect, and it's just to clarify that in terms of the finer detail and the mechanisms as to exactly when the review would take place. It's not something we can explain at this particular meeting, because when we came to drafting the section 106, if we get to that point, we'll bring in specialist advice to advise us on how to best word those finer details of the 106 to make sure it works in as best it reasonably can in the council's favour.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm now going to move us on to public participation. So we have a number of people registered to speak this evening. First on my list is Flick Williams, who is joining us online. So Ms. Williams, can you hear us okay?
Yes, good afternoon.
Okay, we can hear you fine. So you have 3 minutes to address the committee. I'll give you a heads up if I think you're likely to run over, but I know you're usually very on time when you address the committee. And if you can just hold on in case there's any questions from members after you've spoken, and just start in your own time, please.
Chair, members of Planning Committee, many of you will be aware from my other speeches to Council, Executive and the Local Plan Working Group about my ongoing concerns about accessibility, inclusive design and the role of access and design statements in the planning process. The 2004 Planning and Compulsory Purchase Act introduced access and design statements for the express purpose of making developers think properly about how disabled people across all impairment groups would be able to access and use their proposed development. Up until the application before you today, I can honestly say I've not read one single access and design statement submitted to this authority that genuinely did that. Many say little more than it meets Part M of the building regs and we put in some bike sheds. So this application before you is a breath of fresh air. The applicants engaged experienced access consultants, who held a consultation that was as accessible as it possibly could be, given the constraints of venues in the city, and most importantly, genuinely listened to the concerns of disabled people and made amendments to their plans accordingly. Now, that's not to say it's perfect, but I do believe, given the challenges this site presents, particularly with significant level changes, they've worked hard to maximise improvements on the original plans. I heard complaints in the media last week from city businesses about the length of time it had taken to get this application before you. But getting things right and doing them properly takes time. There are no shortcuts. You have a busy afternoon ahead of you, so I shall leave it there. But I should like to take this opportunity to both commend and to thank the Helmsley Group for the inclusive approach they have taken. I really hope that going forward, this can stand as a beacon of best practice within this city, and that future applicants can be encouraged to take a similarly committed approach to inclusive design. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms Williams, and your comments are very warmly received. I'm sure it's nice to hear things in a very positive way. Councillor Burton is indicating she's got a question, I think. Councillor Burton.
Just following what Miss Williams has said, I've just got a question from what I've read in the plans about the amount of accessible accommodation and parking spaces.
If it's a question for officers, if you just need to hold that until we come to the relevant part of the meeting. But if there's any questions for Ms Williams on anything that she's said, then we can. I can take questions. I'm not seeing indication, so thank you very much for your time this evening, and you know that you'll be able to continue watching on the webcast on YouTube. Okay, and the next public speaker I have is Andrew Lawson from York Bid, who I think is joining us at the table. Yes, hadn't seen you before you stood up, but if you'd like to come to the table, and while you're doing so, I'll just remind you, you have 3 minutes to address the committee. I'll give you a heads up if I think you're likely to run over, and if you just sit tight when you're finished, and I'll just see if there's any questions from members, and do start in your own time.
Yes, good evening. The York Bid has been engaged with the Coney Street Riverside project for many years, partly because the Helmsley Group reached out to us during the early days of the concept. They have attended our board on numerous occasions, as well as present plans at bid stakeholder events and also our AGM. This proactive engagement is one of the reasons why the bid board was keen to express its support for the scheme when the council consultation was conducted earlier this year. As well as delivering a range of projects in the city over the years, the York Bid has always endeavoured to highlight the changing consumer trends and the needs for high streets to adapt. Business offerings have altered and will continue to do so, but changing public infrastructure is not always so easy. It requires vision, cooperation, and of course, significant investment. On this point of finance, the bid board has always been mindful that if this regeneration project was not approved, then the question would be, what is the plan B? York has not benefited from any levelling up funding, and it's unlikely that there will be much public finance for regen in the foreseeable future. For this reason, we are lucky to have a privately financed project that will significantly enhance our public realm. Alongside running the York Bid, I've sat on the government's High Street Task Force and have consequently seen various town and city regeneration schemes. York is unique, but it faces similar challenges to many places. For example, how do we repurpose large retail floor space into more manageable units? How do we get more people living and working in the city centre? And how do we create more pleasant spaces that both locals and visitors can enjoy? The Coney Street Riverside has solutions to all these questions and has done this through strong consultation with locals and also with businesses, even displaying its plans within 29 to 31 Coney Street to maximise transparency. I would like to commend the Helmsley Group on their approach over the last few years. As a bid, through close working with the team, we've been allowed to deliver projects such as street art and lighting, shop wraps on vacant units, and most importantly, meanwhile use of empty retail space. This should not be taken for granted. Too often bid projects are thwarted by faceless landlords or property agents that show no interest in our local issues. The bid has always been clear that because Coney Street regeneration will affect anchor stores such as Boots and Smiths, it's important that they work with these businesses on future location plans. But on balance, we are delighted to see that Coney Street Riverside has been recommended for approval. The bid board is hopeful that should plans be approved tonight, we can continue to work closely with Helmsley Group and the City Council to ensure we optimise this exciting opportunity and once again have a Coney Street as a major thoroughfare that locals are proud to talk about. Thank you.
Almost bang on 3 minutes. So thank you very much indeed. So I'll just invite if any members have any questions for you. I'm not seeing any hands, so thank you for your time this evening, and if you'd like to take your place back in the public gallery. Next on my list, I have Max Reeves, who's the applicant in support, and we'll be joined by Tim Ross from O'Neill Associates as the planning consultant, and Timur Tatlioglu, sorry if I've pronounced that wrong, who's here with speaking about heritage. So if the three of you would like to come to the table, and again, you'll have seen 3 minutes to address the committee, and then just sit tight for any questions. Yeah, press the sort of button that looks a bit like a Wi-Fi symbol. Some red lights should come on. It'll go green, and then you're live. Yeah, there you go.
Good afternoon. My name is Max Reeves. I'm Development Director of the Helmsley Group. We're a York-based property company with 40 years experience delivering major projects in the city. This includes Holgate Park, Clifton Park, much of Monk's Cross. We've also developed key riverside sites like Merchant Exchange and the old fire station. Our track record with listed buildings has earned us a reputation for successful project delivery. Today, we're really excited to present the Coney Street Riverside development, a project we believe will shape York's future whilst respecting its heritage. For over 50 years, the city has sought to reconnect Coney Street with the River Ouse. We're now looking to realise that vision by opening up a large stretch of the riverfront that has sat abandoned and inaccessible for far too long. Coney Street Riverside aims to revitalise one of York's iconic streets, transforming it into a vibrant mixed-use hub. Central to this is reconnecting Coney Street to the riverfront with new public spaces, pedestrian routes, and a riverside walkway, all while preserving the street's historic character and heritage assets. From the outset, we recognised that the importance of this site's location meant that this development couldn't be our vision alone. It required a more collaborative approach, and so from day one, we worked in open dialogue with the council to ensure this was a shared vision for the city. So over the past 3 years, the design has evolved through extensive consultation with heritage bodies, planners, and York residents. We would like to take this opportunity to thank everyone who got involved. Their input has helped shape a development which balances ambition with heritage sensitivity whilst maintaining a Yorkness to the scheme's identity. Accessibility has been a key focus throughout. We engage with the public and stakeholders from the outset to ensure this development meets everyone's needs. This includes new public open spaces, step-free access, and a range of accessible living options. We work closely with accessibility consultants and held dedicated consultations, including forums with disabled users, to understand their needs early on. In summary, Coney Street Riverside is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to protect and enhance York's heritage while creating a future-facing development. We've been encouraged by the strong public support and believe this project will reshape York's social heart, offering new public spaces and connections that will be enjoyed for years to come. Beside me, I've got Tim from O'Neill's, our planning consultants, and Timur from Montague Evans, our heritage consultants. Next, behind me will be our architect, Rob, and we'll also have Jane, our accessibility consultants, and Simon on transport. So there'll be 2 panels for directing questions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. And you've slightly stolen my thunder because I was going to remind the committee members. No, so you've done it perfectly, introduced people very well. So we will have a second panel coming to talk about the design and the transport aspects and accessibility and what have you. So it's now an opportunity to really ask questions about the overall vision of the scheme, the any sort of planning aspects and the heritage. So I see Councillor Eyre first, and I'll jot down away.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah. Obviously, in an ideal world, the whole of Coney Street would be included in this, but there is obviously the section in the middle that's not as part of this planning application, which is clear from the comments in there that they were not willing to engage with that. There is a section within Zone 3, which is also not in your ownership. Given you said that there's a shared vision with the City of York Council in terms of delivering this, how come that agreement couldn't be done? And given that played such a key part in the lack of affordable housing, in fact, no affordable housing at all on this scheme, why did this application come forward before that agreement was in place?
From the very start of the site assembly, we bought the first building. We started discussions with the council, which is how they ended up buying an asset within the development, helping to share our vision and helping shape what it would be, deliver these public benefits. The lack of affordable housing within the student element has been a viability discussion, an exercise which has been carried out. And we've done a lot of viability work. In fact, we're doing viability work from the council from the very beginning when we started this project all the way through. So it's not a lack of desire, I'd say, from the council to push for affordability. It's from us side, we need to make sure we can actually putting forward a scheme that is deliverable, and the viability sits alongside that.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Whitcroft was next.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Mr. Reeves. Obviously, you've been commended twice now by the for the engagement that you've done so far, which is really refreshing. So well done there. Obviously, there's going to be work going forward on this. We're going to continue to develop and see how we can use this space. I was just wondering if you've got any plans to continue with that engagement going forward after this committee where you approved, to ensure that you continue with community engagement and that, yeah, to make sure that this is more of a process rather than just a destination.
Absolutely. It's great to have some positive comments for a developer. It doesn't happen often. Yes, we're absolutely committed to further consultation. There's a huge amount of public realm here that's going forward. We're committed to doing additional accessibility consultations as well, and looking at further improvements that can be made to the scheme to make it more accessible. I mean, throughout the consultation, a huge amount has come out around engaging with a lot of the heritage bodies. We've been looking at where we can do historic events and have some panels of information, draw people down there. Also areas, a lot of the design change, we came up with things like introducing water into zone 4 and having an area of play that kids can come down. I think there's a lot more work from our side in terms of what people want to see on the streets and what else we can introduce.
Okay, Councillor Fenton was next.
Thank you, Chair. The report sets out the financial viability conclusion, and on the planning portal there are some far more detailed documents setting out how that position to be derived at, which is that there is a deficit, there's a gap in terms of financial viability. I just wondered, as through the various iterations of the scheme, what consideration had been given to amending the tenure mix. Obviously, the proposal is for entirely student accommodation. The outcome of that being that there is no affordable homes on site, no commuted sum. Just wondered what consideration being given to an alternative tenure mix that perhaps could have, and whether that would have addressed in any way, shape or form the financial viability gap that you've ended up with.
So start with the next zone of Coney Street, which is not involved in this application, that has a residential element to it. So we do have a slight mix from that one. From this application, again, as I mentioned earlier, from the very start, we looked at the viability and what would actually be deliverable on this site. We looked at all different options in terms of offices, which certainly isn't viable at the moment. In order to be able to make student work as a scheme, it needs to be of a certain mass to be fundable and to be viable. And that's how we ended up going down that route. In terms of actual practical elements of how we could develop the site as well, there's a lot of benefits of going down the student use in terms of the splitting up with the heritage and the listed buildings. There were some negative implications around putting flats across whole floors and breaking up those historic floor plates.
Thank you for that. You mentioned at the very beginning a separate site not within the scope of this development that could potentially be brought forward and include general residential use.
Correct. There's another phase which is called Zone 1, which is further down Coney Street, which has residential within it. That's been running parallel. It's not ready to come to committee yet, but it'll be coming forward shortly. It's live in planning.
Okay, thank you. But that will be considered separately, and presumably that will have its own viability assessment.
Yeah, I was going to sort of interject to that point. Any future or other scheme that may or may not be coming from these developers is nothing at all to do with our determination today. We have to make our balance based on the plans, the application that's before us. So I understand why that's being discussed, but I wouldn't want to put any emphasis or detail on anything to do with another scheme that may or may not come forward in due course. Okay, Councillor Fisher, I had you next.
Councillor Fenton has just asked exactly the question I was going to ask, sir.
Fair enough. Looking for further hands from anybody else. I do have a question that I want to ask, but I'll go through anybody else first. Councillor Colwick.
Thank you, Chair. In the grand scheme of things, this is a tiny detail, but forgive me asking, why Waterloo?
Still might be a better answer.
There was a previous route that came down from Coney Street, so it's taking the name from there. So it's retaining some of the lexicon that's York, and we felt it was important to retain that as part of the scheme.
I think there's a piece around, again, it's maybe a small detail, but naming some of these streets. So we've gone for a historic reference in Waterloo Place at the moment, but there's other areas, and we'd like to involve the community in terms of coming up with some of the names of some of these areas as well.
Okay, a couple of questions from me then, and I suppose while we're talking public realm and accessibility and what have you, my understanding is that none of the public realm in this development is to become adopted highway, but from a sort of a layperson's perspective, I just wanted to be clear that your understanding is that a person walking down the street wouldn't know that it was a different, you know, privately owned piece of land versus the publicly owned highway. I suppose what I'm asking is it'll remain permeable 24/7 throughout the whole of that site in the public areas.
Yeah, absolutely. So the access is secured by condition, so that will be controlled, but the actual public rail itself will fall under a management company, which will be paid for by the commercial tenants within the building, or will basically look after it.
Okay,
so you won't be able to tell any difference.
Yeah, no, that's helpful. Thank you. And then just in terms of accessibility, and obviously, you know, you've been commended on the accessibility of the space. Just so we've done belts and braces on it all. I'm assuming that all levels of the building, albeit some bits will be, you know, privately accessible, but it will all be, there'll be level access to every part of the building within the development.
The only elements that aren't fully step-free are within some of the listed buildings, but there's only a couple of units in, and that's because of the constraints of the listed building. But otherwise, there's 2 lifts for every core, and it's fully step-free throughout.
Okay, thank you. And a final question for me, which is, I suppose, kind of around heritage. And it's as much for interest as the overall planning balance. I note that the 20th Century Society have objected to the demolition of the back of the WH Smith's building as a sort of a brutalist piece of architecture that perhaps isn't fashionable at the moment, but might, you know, we might bemoan its loss at some future point. Was there a discussion around whether or not it was viable to retain it? Was it always going to go? Has there been a consideration about its merits or otherwise, or has it just been the view that it wasn't named within the conservation area and therefore was fair game, as it were?
Thank you. It's a really good question, and it's fair to say at the beginning of the scheme, heritage was certainly at the forefront of our minds. So we looked at all of the individual assets and looked at their relative significance. And as part of our assessment, we looked at the relative significance of that 1970s extension, and we talked to your officers as well, and to Historic England and others. It's a 1970s extension, and the building was listed in 1983. So Historic England took account of that, or English Heritage as it was then, took account of that when it was listed. Of course, list descriptions are only tell you so much of the story, and our analysis was that it had some value, but it wasn't of any notable interest in the way that you might otherwise envisage. In the discussions we had with officers and with the other stakeholders, again, it was considered that part of the building didn't contribute materially to the significance of the building, which is primarily to the front. Now, in relation to the other parts and other options, I'll pass over.
We did. We looked at a scheme initially where we can convert the existing buildings. As we bought this development, actually, it was bought piecemeal, so these developments were looked at individually if we could never complete the site assembly. In reality, the building doesn't convert very well. It's designed as large retail floor plate. That's really what it is. I think what we're providing now, what we're proposing to replace it with, is something which is more flexible, and let's say in 40 years' time, there isn't a demand for student accommodation, we're putting something there which has the flexibility for a different use.
Thank you. Councillor Burton, is that supplementary or, well, it doesn't actually matter. You can come next and ask a question.
I'm reading all the information we've been given. I noticed that 7% of the rooms were going to be accessible for disabled students. So that, I think, is about 25. And there are 2 car parking spaces because of the limitations with space for car parking and because it's in the centre of the foot streets. I know that you've had accessible consultants. I've been to some consultations and they've been very accessible. But I'm wondering, is that really enough? What happens if disabled students want to visit somebody in the city centre during the day when it's shut? Will they be able to get in with a taxi, for instance? And is there absolutely no way that you can increase the number of spaces? And also, have you built in space for mobility scooter storage within the accommodation?
So in terms of mobility scooters, there's 4 mobility scooter spaces proposed in terms of parking, which will also have electric charging as well. There's accessible cycle parking as well, integrated into the cycle storage areas. I mean, the architect and our access consultant are on next, so you can ask them very detailed questions about this. With regard to the car parking, blue badge parking, obviously this is a foot street area, and I think it's exempt from even blue badge vehicles accessing it. There is provision about 300 meters in terms of in the city centre, in terms of additional blue badge parking. I mean, we're bound by the constraints of the development, unfortunately. We went through an exercise also with the highways team at the council, looking at what percentage provision was appropriate, because students are typically obviously younger, and therefore the proportion of the population that has mobility needs is lower than the general population, because it's often older people that have the really the real severe access requirements. So they accepted in terms of that level of provision was appropriate for the amount of accommodation being provided. I think what we tried to do in terms of the accommodation, we've tried to have a choice of accommodation. So while we've got 5% roughly of fully accessible rooms, but then we've got ambulant rooms as well. So there's a choice. So the cluster flats, we've got bigger rooms within there and larger kitchen amenity spaces. So if you have mobility needs, you can share with your mates, or you can have your own studio, which is bigger and accessibly laid out. So there's a choice of accommodation there. And that's just to cater for different needs, really. So that's how and I guess the other thing to bear in mind is, I mean, it is a highly accessible location. So visitors would be expected to arrive on public transport. I mean, other than blue badge parking, it's totally car free.
I kind of get what you're saying. I'd be very interested to see the research behind younger disabled people not using mobility aids as much. Personally, as when I was a student, found it rather good to see so many disabled students using disability. It's quite refreshing to see so many. As a disabled person myself, that's one thing. Sorry, what was that last thing that you said?
Sustainable.
Oh, about visitors. So but that's sort of presupposing that the visitors are not disabled as well. So that's what concerns me. It's 2 spaces. I think we had a building recently that was only proposing 2 spaces for quite a large building, and we increased that. I can also see that increasing the amount of parking space will lower the income generated in other aspects of this building, but I do think it's something to be considered. Because I think it's excluding people, you know, you're expecting the people who come on public transport to maybe be able to do that. I mean, and that is the difference.
Councillor Burton, I'm just gonna interrupt you slightly there because some of what you're saying, I think, is things that you may want to, or the committee may want to take into consideration when we come to the determination in terms of the overall planning balance.
Okay.
It's maybe not something that,
No,
that the applicant can necessarily answer, but
Uh-huh.
also just to remind you that we've also got the applicant's access consultant coming up next. So in a way, some of the detail might be better asked to them.
Okay. Thanks.
I'm just looking for any further questions for the panel that we have in front of us at the moment. Councillor Clark, are you indicating, or are you just looking at me? No, not indicating. In which case, I'm not seeing anybody else indicating that they have questions. So I will thank the three of you for your time and speaking to us, and then invite the second three that are coming to speak to us, which is we have Rob Miller, who is the project architect, and Simon Pratt, who is a transport consultant, and Jane Simpson, who is the accessibility consultant. Mr. Miller, I think you're going to give us a presentation, 3 minutes, and then we'll open up to questions. So whenever you're ready to start.
Good afternoon, members of the committee. I am Rob Miller, one of the team of architects at Brown-based studio, Brown & Company. The scheme presented to you today represents 3 years of collaboration with officers from the City of York Council, Historic England, the Civic Trust, the York Conservation Area Advisory Panel, the police, and equality protected characteristics, engagement, the general public, and many more. Throughout this iterative process, we have taken on board comments and evolved the scheme. A good example of this is the Accessibility Forum, which led to significant improvements to the inclusivity of the public realm and the internal layouts. Coney Street Riverside is a heritage-led master plan, which includes the restoration of residential uses to the upper floors and improvements to the historic buildings, including sensitively designed new shop fronts. To facilitate the new Riverside public realm, we are proposing to remove the unsympathetic modern rear extensions, including a designated detractor. The Conservation Officer has commended our efforts, stating that they applaud the consideration given to the individual listed buildings and the endeavour to limit heritage impact of the proposals. The new Riverside buildings draw design inspiration from the existing Riverside vernacular, such as the Guildhall, Yorkshire Herald, and Ebor Hall, to embed a distinct sense of Yorkness within the proposals. The development's varied heights contribute to the choppy roofs of York and have been carefully designed to maintain, enhance, and create new views within the conservation area. Sustainability is a key focus of the scheme, which will achieve BREEAM Excellent. A smart, highly insulated building will minimise operational energy needs whilst being heated through a combination of air and water source heat pumps. The scheme retains embodied carbon on site through reusing existing buildings and is designed for potential future adaptability. In collaboration with leading access consultant Jane Simpson and award-winning landscape designers Gillespie's, we have created an inclusive, accessible and family-friendly public space for everyone to enjoy. A new active street, Waterloo Place, will restore a historic water lane and create one of 2 new public routes to the riverside. The public realm will feature a mixture of public seating, accessible spaces, a flexible riverside space for local events, as well as new trees and planting, resulting in a 94% net biodiversity gain over the site.
You've got a bit under 30 seconds left.
The Street Life project, a UK government and university-funded initiative, emphasised the public's desire to revitalise Coney Street by creating space for local businesses, diversifying the city centre, introduction of urban greening, and improving public access to Riverside. We listened. Riverside Coney Street will fulfil this vision. Thank you for your time. We have Jane and Simon here to discuss accessibility and highways issues.
Okay, thank you very much. So again, I'll just invite members if you have any questions for any of the panel that are present. Councillor Whitcroft, I saw you first, and then Councillor Fenton.
Thanks, Chair. Thank you, Mr. Miller, for that presentation. I did raise a question with officers about the plans earlier, and as the architects were hoping you might be able to help me with this. Obviously, having a riverside development in any capacity, safety has got to be an absolute issue of paramount, massive concern, I know, for residents. I did ask about the railings. I don't know whether you've got any sort of further safety plans to do with the area to understand in case anyone falls in, to prevent that, and how you would, how the development's going to cope with that as an issue.
Okay, so the railings have to meet the building regulations height, which is 1.1 meters or above. What we did as part of the development of the landscape was to ensure that there wasn't any furniture close to that balustrading as well, to avoid any people scaling that to then. And then any planters that are near the water's edge are raised up to that height as well. So in terms of that is meeting building regulation standards. The other thing I'd say is the railings themselves have been designed in terms of vertical fashion, therefore wouldn't essentially create a ladder to get over the top of that.
May I?
Supplementary,
Thank you. Just a brief supplementary on you mentioned the planters, and I think I have noticed in the illustrations that the planters at some point, would they replace the railings at some point, or will the railings be there throughout?
It replaces the railings in some instances on zone 3. So they go perpendicular to the river edge. You can't really see it there because obviously it's so small. But they are if you go back to zone 3, the closer, go back. So you see the brown squares. So that is the planters at a high level. We've taken out the planting just so you see the building, but it essentially continues the line of the balustrading.
Okay, Councillor Fenton, I saw you next.
Thank you. The officer report includes a summary of the comments of the design and conservation team, and it states that despite the improvements of the current scheme, officers are unable to support the proposal on architectural design, master planning and conservation area grounds. I just wondered from the work that you've done and the various iterations and discussions you've had, were there any particular elements on which you felt unable to address some of those concerns which clearly remain unresolved and have led to that objection appearing in the report?
It's tricky. Good question. We have done a considerable amount of consultation with the design and conservation team, and had several iterations of revisions to this scheme, which ultimately reduced the building height by a story, 4-story on zone 4 and 2 stories on zone 3. I believe the main issue is around the courtyard space within the middle of the development, and essentially the protected status of those plots are to maintain the legibility of the plots themselves. So how we've tried to do that is by articulating the facade as how it's shown on the development. So through mass articulation, the gabled approach, the material changes, and also the landscape itself tries to reflect those burgage plots. This was to ensure we've approached it in this way due to making the buildings work in terms of an internal arrangement. One of the disagreements I guess we have with design and conservation is the fact that the buildings at the moment already merge those plots due to those extensions of the rears of those listed buildings. So what we have done is remove those modern listed buildings, provided those listed buildings back to their original layout. as small townhouse properties rather than elongated buildings that stretch down to the river. And I guess that, I believe, is the sticking point. Sorry, I'd just add on that within that report, it also praises the architectural facades, how the design process, etc.
Okay, next on my list was Councillor Fisher.
Thank you, Chair. I think this question might well be best directed to Mr. Pratt, if possible, because it concerns the end of term and start of term arrangements for the student accommodation. Now, students do bring heavy stuff to university. Some of them may not want to actually lug them halfway across York. And Coney Street is extremely restricted in terms of its car access. Have you given thought to the logistics of getting 385 students in and out of this accommodation at the start of term? Because on other purpose-built student accommodation, we've normally insisted on an end of term, start of term plan to ensure that students can be got in safely without literally jamming up the road around them.
I think as part of this application, there is a condition that's going to be set with regards to a management plan at the start and end of each term. But having worked on other residential units, student residential units in the city, you know, there has been plans where the accommodation is over 51 weeks rather than 52. It means that people leaving the units are leaving the units on a different week to the new people arriving, so it limits the congestion. The other consideration we did give as part of the transport assessment was using off-site areas where students could drop off heavy baggage and leave it so the operator can bring that in on one vehicle rather than multiple vehicles coming in onto Coney Street. Then that way there could be limited number of vehicles waiting on Coney Street at any one time. The units are actually managed, the security 24/7, and so that would assist with the arrival of any baggages if and when the students don't arrive at the same time as their baggages. So we have given some consideration, and you know the condition should assist in managing that process to ensure that not everybody turns up at the same time.
Thank you.
Councillor Eyre, I think you had a supplementary on that.
Yeah, I think, and I appreciate that not turning up at the same time, but I've actually dropped my daughter off at university this year, so I know some of that. When would you actually envisage that to be done? Because as correctly pointed out, there is no access to that street during the day, Monday to Sunday. So the only time it's available to actually get vehicular access at any point is in the evenings. Given Friday, Saturday, Sunday on Coney Street is possibly one of the busiest times in the city. Mondays to Thursdays aren't particularly light. When exactly would you envisage students moving into this accommodation at the start of term? Even if you try to stagger it, it's normally done over a weekend. You would do a Saturday, Sunday, sort of a rolling 12-hour program with 1 hour here across the thing. You're going to have the best part of 2 hours an evening to get 358 students in.
Well, usually they arrive and depart over the weekends, as you mentioned, and so the arrivals can be brought in first thing on the morning before the road shuts, and then after 5 o'clock, and that will have to be articulated to the students coming in, that if they bring their luggage and there's a van bringing their luggage to the site, or even if they're bringing their own luggage to the site, if they're not coming via public transport, they're coming via a car, then that will be made aware to anybody that lives in the accommodation itself. The management of the transport to and from the site would need to be coordinated, associated with the Foot Street's timings.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Stewart, I had you on my list next.
Thanks, Jay. It's a bit of a follow on from Councillor Fenton's, and in your comments on design, you particularly use the word Yorkness, which I'm sure isn't a word, but what more would you say about, in what ways the scheme is sort of York compared to, what we wouldn't get if it was elsewhere? And I think one of the comments in the report is about that Waterloo Place is too wide for, so it's a specific sort of negative. So what would be the things about building design that you would say are particularly York?
Okay, so we went through quite a rigorous process of analysing both the historic development of the river and also the current properties themselves. So as you may already know, but this side of this river was initially a had warehouse or industrial status, and then that was gentrified later on and we now see the townhouses that are present on Coney Street themselves. However, some of that warehouse typology is still present on the riverside itself. So you can obviously see that from the Yorkshire Herald building, the Picture and Piano building, and also the building that houses Yates's. So what we've done in the scheme is to reflect that those characteristics of those buildings. So verticality of windows. Many of those buildings are highly detailed. So we've brought in a significant amount of like brick detailing around the facades. So that in theory, they're quite simple properties, but then with this elaborate detailing, strong shoulder is in strong eaves height to on the buildings. And within the building design itself, we've tried to reflect that. In terms of Waterloo Place, there is a constraint on that. So we have a existing sewer that runs underneath Waterloo Place, which has essentially defined the size. However, throughout our development of the public realm, we have looked at the patterns of how historic patterns of going down to the river and then approached a smaller Snickle Way approach on Zone 3 to approach the river as well. So we have a larger route and a smaller route, which may be more akin to that historic pattern that we have. The size of Waterloo Place, obviously, whilst it may not follow the historic pattern, it has an advantage of being able to provide accessible ramp access to the riverside, urban greening, public seating, and also visitor cycle spaces, all of which we wouldn't be able to achieve with a smaller, more restricted route down to the river.
Okay, Councillor Burton, is that a supplementary to this, or is it in which case, actually, you're next on my list anyway, so.
It's back to my question about parking, so as I've got you all here now. So the two parking spaces, where will they actually be? And is there any scope for having more than two parking spaces for disabled students?
Sorry. So the two parking spaces are actually located in an existing car park around the back of the next building. So they are currently used as car parking spaces. We are increasing the size of them to ensure they are for accessible measures. I guess the challenge we have, whilst the design and the quantum of accommodation, two spaces have been told that that is sufficient for that quantum. I guess the other challenge we have is we are in a public right of way, public realm here. And I guess that if we were providing any more car parking spaces anywhere else, we would be within Coney Street or on Waterloo Place or anything like that. So there is a challenge around providing. Did you want to add something there?
Well, I think the key thing from the design perspective is that we're in the foot streets of York, and so our accessibility by car is restricted over much of the day, and obviously it affects people coming to and from the site as well at the start of the term time. But from our perspective, we're looking at car-free development. With the spaces provided for accessibility and things. We're looking at people with disabilities such as epilepsy and things like that can't drive as well, and from the site, it meant that people with accessibility issues, it will be limiting because of the limited car access that we can gain during the day. The other thing that we did consider as well was the availability of other student accommodation within the city that provides more accessibility by car, and that we just didn't feel that this was the right place to encourage any more car trips to this location.
Yeah, sorry. So the other thing I'd like to highlight that is not all disabilities are physical. So whilst we are providing 5% of accessible rooms, we also are providing a number of ambulant rooms and adaptable rooms, and we are trying to approach this as rather than it's just physical disabilities, we're providing a wealth of accommodation and amenities to provide for all disabilities.
Yeah.
It's working. I think obviously parking is an issue in York and has been for some considerable time in terms of getting people into the centre of York, which is one of the reasons why part of the scheme we made sure that there was a scooter provision for charging and the capacity to have adapted cycles, etc. So there's a lot more alternatives than purely parking. I understand with visitors it is quite difficult. And am I understanding correctly that at the moment that blue badges are allowed into York if you are a local blue badge holder, as opposed to, is it any blue badge now, is it? Okay, I was involved in the York, I was involved in the York Foot Streets work a while ago, so things have changed slightly. It is one of those areas, lots of projects at the moment, people are going car free, and I understand how disabled people rely on them. They do rely on them. And there are no spaces at the moment, but you're saying that it's potential if
No, there are 2 spaces identified.
Yeah, but as I say, part of the issue within the actual student accommodation, ensuring that access to all of those parkings was fully accessible. There's lifts associated with it. There's also every level has been checked to make sure that it's accessible to get into those, because I've worked in so many projects in the past where even the cycle parking wasn't accessible because they thought people were fit and could get there. So that has been the compromise, unfortunately, but we've tried to put in as much as possible into the actual accommodation.
Just thinking out of the box sort of thing. I know in the City of London, that if you go to some of the buildings there that have very limited parking, they have actual car parking that's stacked. So you drive it, somebody drives your car in and it goes into a stacking system. And when you need it, and if you've got 24-hour security, that might be an alternative to allow you to have more places. It's just a suggestion. I'm not saying you should do it, but I'm a bit concerned that this is a development for a type of student with a certain type of disability, and also that you're restricting people by, well, not restricting by age, but I mean, there are mature students who go to university, going back to the previous comment about if you're younger, you might not need a mobility aid as much as, which could well be true. But, you know, you may get older students living there. That's just a comment, but anyway.
I can just say that the statistically, and this has come from, because I've done quite a lot of student accommodation, statistically, students generally do not have as many, I would class as physical disability. That's not to say that they don't. And some will have more profound disabilities. One of the reasons that we worked on the rooms to such an extent that they are larger than you would expect. They're better than best practice. They go beyond BS, because BS hasn't really got anything, well, certainly the committee. And that does allow the facility for somebody who is in a potentially more probably less mobile. You know, we've got 2 lifts to make sure they're never going to be not to get there. The rooms are big enough to take effectively electric wheelchairs, not just your manual chair, which is what you would normally get in a student accommodation. So I think there's a bit of kind of we've tried to get in as much as we possibly can to ensure that students can. And I think the disability aspect is because what we're looking at is, you know, you can have people of short stature. So we'll have 2 heights of this is getting to detail, but the 2 heights of the eyes to see through, so you can actually do it. There's ambulant, because obviously people have extra requirement for storage, and there's also the well-being, and the whole of the inside has been looked at in terms of not having long corridors, having breakout spaces so that people don't feel sort of traumatized by moving through those. So there's been a lot more gone into it than it's kind of how do you stop or where do you stop, and the next detail is going to be the fascinating bit, particularly since when you're looking at neurodiversity, because that is another whole new ball game completely. So
absolutely, and it's just, I know within the disability sector, which I'm very active in, that the focus on neurodiversity at the moment is a good thing, but it mustn't preclude physical disabilities as well, and that is the danger at the moment.
No, it definitely hasn't. It's one of those factors.
I'm just going to jump in at that point of just pulling us back into planning realm, because I think interesting and vitally important as it is, we've also got to just consider the application before us. Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Councillor Clark.
Thanks, Chair. I just wanted to ask a bit about flooding and flood risk. So obviously we're increasingly experiencing high levels of river over the winter, and it's 3 or 4 meters regularly. I just wanted, because there's some discussion, or at least some statements about what would be done. The PBSA operator, the purpose-built student accommodation operator, would have a flood plan and action plan in place to remove maybe cycles and things. I mean, at 60% of the number of tenants, that's probably 200 or 300 cycles. Just how regularly you're thinking those the cycle, you know, the action plan would have to be implemented, and the cycles would have to be kind of moved, and where would they go? Just if you could just elaborate a little bit about that.
The whole development is being raised up to above 100-year flood plus climate change emergency. So in theory, none of the public realm or any of the buildings should ever flood.
What's that level? Do you know what that level is?
It's 11.27, I believe it is. So part of what we're doing is we're raising that whole public realm space and allowing for a water attenuation underneath the building. So we're improving water attenuation on the site and also avoiding any flooding along that area.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay. I'm not seeing any further hands with any further questions. I don't have any myself, so I think I can say thank you very much for your time this evening. If you'd like to take places back in the public gallery. That's the end of our public participation section, and I think that's an appropriate point for us to take a short adjournment. So I make it just after 6 o'clock. I think if we could come back at 6:10, and if I can just remind everybody, committee members, please don't discuss the application amongst yourselves, and certainly don't discuss it with anybody from the public gallery. People who need to use the loos, just through the door behind me. And as I say, we can come back by 6:10, that'd be great. Okay, welcome back everybody to today's meeting of Planning Committee A. We are partway through determining applications for the site of 19 to 33 Coney Street. And we are now moving into members' questions to officers based on anything in the report, anything that you may have heard in public participation. Councillor Burton, I think earlier on I stopped you from asking a question around accessibility of the accommodation. I don't know if you have that question as a burning question that you want to raise straight away, or I can come back to you in due course. I'll put you down then and I'll come back to you. So Councillor Melly.
Thank you, Chair. I was just wondering if officers could please clarify the policy position about open spaces and green spaces, because obviously open space and green space is very important for future residents, potential future residents of the site, if approved, for mental health and physical health. The report says that officers are satisfied that scheme is broadly compliant with open space policies. I was just wondering whether that's because there's enough open space on site to meet policy requirements, or if there's enough provision nearby that it isn't required on site. And also, it looks like the calculations of how much open space is on site includes public open space, which won't necessarily feel like open space for the residents. 66 and 67 is what I'm looking at the moment.
The policy, the open space policy is in the context of public open space. So we've took the decision that the amount of public realm means that there's an appropriate provision of open space, but that I would say that my understanding of the open space policy in the local plan is that it's about open space that has public access. It's not in the context of neighbours, residents' amenity.
I mean, the report says it's for recreation and amenity. Will the open space, such as the Riverside Walkway, will that serve a purpose of recreation and amenity for future residents of the student accommodation?
It will be public realm that will provide amenity space, so it does provide the typology of space that we'd expect to have through the policy. So we felt it's that, given that public realm provision is part of the scheme, we felt it was acceptable in terms of the open space provision. And then in terms of the sports provision that the policy mentions, again, we've tended to take the view on the student schemes that we don't seek a sports contribution because it's something that's provided for via the universities.
Councillor Eyre, I think you had a supplementary on this as well.
Yeah, I flagged that section of the report as well, because the comments on page 38, 39 completely ignore sport. It then goes on page 67 to make reference to sport. And I don't think the claim that the university provides sports facilities is actually entirely true. The university provides some sports facilities for certain activities that take place on, but I know, for example, students play in local cricket teams, they play in local football teams. There are a whole range of students that don't do sports on university land, but do sports in the city. So I'm confused as to why we don't require some level of contribution to the wider sports facilities, not just the university pitches, which generally are used for university sports.
That's consistently the approach we've taken. I appreciate what you're saying, but that's the way we've applied the policy when it's come to purpose-built student accommodation.
Okay, is this a supplementary? Yeah, Councillor Melly.
Thank you, Chair. On that subject, if there's an application in the future, potentially even decades and decades in the future, for change of use because it isn't viable as student accommodation anymore, is it then possible at that point to amend the Section 106 agreement or enter into a new Section 106 agreement to then provide that sport contribution and affordable housing contribution and everything?
That's a really difficult question to answer. It depends what it comes forward for and viability and everything else. So potentially, but I can't say for certain.
I'm not going to name any names, but if I can just ask committee members not to chat amongst yourselves whilst we're actually sort of hearing things. It's distracting for the members, but also I don't want to give any impression that people are debating anything to do with the application whilst we're in session, as it were. Councillor Fenton, I had you next.
Thank you. Just in terms of provision for future residents, the Page 42 of the report talks about local primary healthcare services being at capacity, and it has been decided not to request a contribution because students can access health services on site. I just wondered, is that position evidenced through an assessment of where other student developments have been established that students do not attempt to register with community GP practices? It's a case that they would always register with campus practices. I just wondered whether that was the position we've taken there is informed by evidence of what we've seen as student developments have been established sort of outside of the sort of campus area.
So that position is consistent with when we've had other student schemes and the NHS have sought a request, the position is consistent with how we've addressed those schemes, in that we feel that it's something, again, that the university to a degree provides for. It's also a person's second residence, if you like. It's not their permanent place of residence, but primarily because of what the universities provide for, we've consistently taken a view that NHS is not a contribution that we'd apply towards purpose-built student accommodation. I think in any event, there's also the viability to be mindful in this particular case. So if we were applying the ask for the NHS, we'd be looking at the viability again, and we wouldn't be able to provide for it even if we thought it was necessary and justified because of the viability.
Okay, Councillor Eyre, I think you had supplementary on this one as
Yeah, because again, I've flagged that one because I don't think the report's actually correct there. It's not provided on campus. So the one, for example, at York University, Kimberlow Hill, is a general NHS GP practice. It's not provided by the campus. It's a general, because I'm a member of that GP practice. It was the one that moved from Hull. So the university don't provide it. Those students do access general practice that is open to everybody. It's not. And I also question the fact that they're there for 30 odd weeks out of 52. It doesn't necessarily create a 50% less demand on people's health situation. So I don't think that's factually correct. I take your point about viability, but the statement that the universities provide health services on campus isn't true. They access mainstream GPs, one of which happens to be based quite close to university campus, but is nothing to do with the university.
So I think the officers have given their answer to the substantive question. I guess that then becomes something that we as a committee need to weigh in our overall planning balance. Councillor Eyre, I actually had you down as my next substantive question. So
well, the good thing is we've got through 2 of my 4 questions. So the first one, I'm happy to come back to me later on as well, is I mean, obviously this is a planning balance versus the gain versus the harm that's in there. I've tried accessing the retail impact assessment and the retail assessment on the website. Both documents are not available on the council website, so I wasn't able to read them. Obviously, this features a switch from predominantly retail to a mix of retail and leisure usage. Without being able to see that, my question generally is around what is that actual financial benefit? So the Chamber of Commerce quote 175 million. I don't know if that's from the missing reports, but then is that 175 net gain because there will be a loss from the retail plus the replacement income, or is that it was that general economic system? What is the current value of the site economically to us in terms of GVA or whatever, and then what is the new value, and then what is the actual net gain of the two? Because I suspect the 175 is just the whole site, not net of what was already there at present.
I can obviously only answer that question indirectly, because I mean the approach that we've taken in terms of the retail, we applied the retail policy of the local plan that's relevant, that tries to protect retail, and it sets out the approach that you take if you're losing retail, and we are losing some because of the student accommodation as the access points through. But we've worked through policy R3, which deals with retail and how we assess proposals for non-retail uses, and we're happy that when we work through that criteria, that the retail uses proposed are compliant with that. So there's no policy conflict in that respect, but I simply can't even begin to start to answer the literal question about what financial benefits might or might not be derived from the scheme.
Okay, and I think you had a second question as well.
And the second question, which won't surprise officers, is around the viability issue. Obviously, we're losing all affordable housing from this. So the original starting point from the first council valuation assessment offered about 1.3 million for affordable homes. That's obviously been challenged by the applicant on 3 points, one of which is the cost of purchasing the land from the council itself. The report said that they struggled to reconcile including that purchase price inside the valuation. So why did they do that? So I can quote it says, our valuation assessment says, while this is technically correct, so in the letter dated 8th of July, the applicant has stated that they've omitted the EU value of 2527 Coney Street in the assessment of the land value. Whilst this is technically correct, we are struggling to reconcile how the value of 25 to 27 Coney Street can be attributed to the landowner, given it's currently owned by a third party, i.e. the local authority. But then it was included, and that, I mean, when you take that in, that 1.5 payment to the council is actually the difference between the affordable contribution and no affordable contribution. And our own valuation says that it shouldn't be included.
I'm not sure whether there was somewhat of a issue with the initial viability appraisal that was done for us, in that it didn't have the commentary on that particular property. There might have been a misunderstanding, but what that second viability appraisal goes on to explain is that the assessor has looked at the viability for us, has come up with and used what he feels to be an appropriate land value for that particular property, based on what it offers at the moment, and how, if you apply the viability inputs that you're supposed to, what the incentive for the developer would be, the landowner, sorry, if they were to sell it. So he's used a property value, what he feels is appropriate for that particular property, and fed all that into the appraisal. And it's come out as it's come out that there isn't any money in the scheme at the moment to provide for affordable housing. There was also, between the first and the second, there was a significant number of units that were taken out of the scheme. The amount of development proposed was reduced through negotiations, so that was a different input that went into the second appraisal.
Okay. Next I had Councillor Whitcroft.
Thank you, Chair. Just going back to that point I raised in a few questions around safety, particularly along the river. I'm satisfied with the answers that you've given me and that the applicants and architects gave me around the height. I was just wondering if there's any provision or view to add in something like, I know sometimes there are life buoys or life rings that can be installed along the river to make sure that if someone does fall in or someone goes past who has fallen in, that they can get the help they need. Is there any capacity within planning to sort of look at having that brought in and how that works in terms of paying for them? Just because I'm very conscious that the river in York remains something that can be incredibly dangerous.
I mean, we can be mindful of that when we look at the detailed condition for the landscape design. The landscape design would probably also consult the police, who look at architectural liaison and safety and whatnot, so they could probably feed in and help us out with that process. So it's something we can be mindful of when we're looking at that detailed landscaping design, yes.
Councillor Stewart.
Yeah, just on that point, I mean, I'm not too worried about people sort of going into the river, because however high the barriers are, ultimately somebody can go in. But my concern would be on the ability to get out of the river. And, if you think about, and I appreciate there's not a principal difference here with what would happen at the existing, picture and piano site and everything like that. But further down, for example, at the pub, what's the pub called? The Sam Smith's pub. King's Arms, yeah. If someone falls in the river there, off the bridge, for example, then hauling them to the side is not, an easy process, but it's not as difficult as here. If somebody falls in here, it's as good as impossible. To save somebody's life, you'd have to have a life buoy straight after them. You'd have to have someone jump in, and then it's very difficult. I know there's a bit of land across the far side, but I do think that potentially is a concern, that however good the fencing is, somebody in silliness in terms of sitting on it for a photo could fall over backwards. It's not a deal breaker in my view, but it's to get the best possible solution. And I would think we're only going to get that best possible solution at this stage rather than months down the line.
I think I think we'd engage with the police to get their safety advice to see what's best in the scheme when none of us are qualified in that particular field. So it's only something we can work out through the condition.
So an appropriate place to capture that request. I'm just thinking like if there was an informative on.
We've got a landscaping condition.
We could have something in it as an informative. So we're just thinking that perhaps the way to capture that is through an informative on the landscaping condition. So I think if members are happy that we just seek to tweak that wording so that we capture something of that element within the informative on that condition. I'm seeing lots of nods, so I'm taking that as given. Councillor Fisher, is this supplementary on this subject? Go on, I'll come to you. Councillor Fenton was ahead of you again, but I'll come to you.
Thank you. It's just about the landscaping and any trees which plant or die. It doesn't specify a time period. Could I suggest that added in after any trees or plants which during the lifetime of the development die? Because the landscaping on this area is absolutely critical to the success of this. And the one thing that I don't want to see in 5 years' time is trees dying. It'll just give the whole area a grotty look. So I think we need to specify that it is during the lifetime of the development in it.
No, I think we used to give you 5 years every time and we deleted 5 years. So it was perpetuity, but we can literally write perpetuity if it's not clear enough that that's the intention.
I think let's do that and make sure it's absolutely crystal clear that it's in perpetuity. Again, I think that a number of committees over a number of years have sought to make those changes. Councillor Fenton, I had you next on my list.
Thank you, Chair. This is paragraph 5.16 about nomination agreements, and the paragraph sets out why it's considered it would not be appropriate to require the applicant to demonstrate that a nomination agreement had been entered into for the student beds. I may be kind of worrying unnecessarily, but what potential issues might arise from that in terms of the usage of the rooms as intended, or is it purely a logistical matter that we shouldn't be concerned about? But I did see that, and it did set alarm bells ringing somewhat. But I just wondered whether this was not unusual in terms of there have been similar student developments where there hadn't been an agreement entered into early doors with an educational establishment.
I think this one is, we don't, at this point in time, we don't think that we're in a position to insist on that. So that's why we've said it. I see your point, what you're saying, but at this point in time, given the level of objection to the modifications to the policy, I just don't think we're in a position to insist on it at this point in time.
So I suppose following on from that, thinking of other student accommodation schemes that have been approved, where presumably, again, we were unable to require nomination agreements. Is this unusual, or is this how it normally pans out? Because we can't require it, and applicants don't voluntarily enter into a nomination agreement.
This isn't unusual. Most the ones that I'm not aware, and this is not aware at the moment of any others that have had nomination agreements.
Okay, Councillor Maroney.
Thank you, Chair. Can I ask whether it's in the remit of this committee to consider what may or may not happen to current retail outlets
Can you just clarify what you mean by that?
Well, for example, one store is being demolished.
Yeah.
I just wondered whether there are plans to maintain their presence in the centre of York or not.
We look at retail as a whole, not specifically one retailer. So that's what we've assessed as part of the proposal, the impacts on the retail implications, as Councillor Eyre alluded to, the retail impact assessment. So we have looked at it, but we don't look at specific retailers because they're all in the same use class.
Thank you.
Okay. I'm just going to offer to come back to Councillor Burton. No, you've even indicated.
I don't know whether this falls within the remit, and I think it's probably different to what I intended to ask, actually. I was just wondering, given that it's right in the centre of town, there's the issues with the river, and that there's the proximity to all the bars, the restaurants and everything there, whether the consideration had been given to sort of parties and that sort of event taking place within this accommodation, and whether the police had been consulted, or the the people who are running the accommodation, whether that would be a risk to, because it seems like a very good place to have a big party to me.
The North Yorkshire Police were consulted as part of the proposals, and they've offered no objection to that. If they become an issue as part of the proposal, we do have neighbourhood policing and issues such as that, but North Yorkshire Police haven't objected.
I think as well, if it was to become a nuisance in terms of tenants, as it were, in a development, then those would likely be things that would fall out with the planning process, but that would be things like neighbourhood enforcement, or those kind of mechanisms that would be about managing that kind of antisocial activity, which I think is probably what you're pushing at.
And it wasn't necessarily just the tenants; it was sort of visitors on scale, and not necessarily invited visitors. I just wondered with the positioning of it, but I might be just being a bit old, so.
Councillor Fisher.
Thank you. The name WH Smith suddenly brought up a point. Whilst not talking about specific retailers, WH Smith does have the post office for the centre of York. Do we know whether that facility will be maintained throughout this development? And if not, where are the nearest available ones? Because obviously there was a huge furore when the post office was moved from its original location down to WH Smith. So I just wonder whether there may be an acceptable delay in delivery.
This is the same as my previous answer. It's the same use class, the use class. So we wouldn't have that level of information.
Okay, Councillor Burton.
Quite supplementary to that, going back to sort of the chemist, the pharmacy that's presently there, is that a public health issue at all? Or is it again out of your remit into a different council remit, really?
It's exactly the same answer that I've just given. It's exactly the same answer that I've just given.
Okay, Councillor Eyre.
I suspect I know the answer, but going into, because I was going to ask something similar to that, is we should be doing a pharmaceutical needs assessment as part of our public health, so that should be a document that should feed into the planning. Did you reference the previous pharmaceutical needs assessment or any emerging pharmaceutical needs assessment?
I've just, in terms of this application, it's the same use class, so that's what we've looked at in terms of the assessment. We wouldn't look at individual stores as part of it. We look at the use class as a whole.
But a pharmacy isn't a store. That's part of health provision. It's primary.
I can't hear you say again.
Pharmacies are primary care as part of the health system as well. It's not just a retail use. It is, so we should have a pharmaceutical needs assessment which tells us and informs us about the potential loss of pharmacies, the same as we would potential loss of a GP surgery or the potential loss of a hospital facility.
As far as we only look at applying that policy as far as I'm aware. If it's an NHS type facility that's being closed, then I can't remember the reference to the policy, but then we look at that policy, but it's not something that we've done in this case.
A pharmacy is an NHS facility, same as a GP.
So I think that the line that I'm going to take on this is that the officers have given you an answer that it hasn't been done. If you want to take that into consideration when you're considering the overall planning balance, then that's where that then sits. I'm looking at Councillor Fenton.
Just get clarification on something that came up earlier around phases, and obviously future phases associated with this development would be considered separately on their own merits. So it's just from the perspective of the report talks about the council revisiting the viability assessment as the development comes forward. Would there be any provision to for that reassessment of the viability to be undertaken in conjunction with a future phase, or would it have to be entirely separate with no read across or consideration of the viability assessment of a future phase associated with this? Because obviously the viability is quite a central issue in our consideration of this scheme, and it raises questions in my mind, at least, about whether it's at all permissible for us to consider a viability assessment that may accompany a future phase linked to this one or not.
Just for clarification, I think, are you referring to the zone 1 that was discussed earlier? Yeah.
We're not considering that application, and I don't, off the top of my head, and I might be wrong, I don't even think that's a major planning application. So I don't even think there would be a requirement for any contributions anyway. That's off the top of my head. I can check exactly what it is. But it's a much smaller planning application. It's not of this scale. So Jonathan's just going to check in terms of what that proposes. But I don't think it would trigger any level of contribution. I think we'll just check for you.
Just while you're checking, Councillor Millie, have you got?
I was just wondering, I'm wondering if Councillor Fenton's referring to, I don't know the name of it in planning terms, but if there were multiple small developments that when they add up, they look like one congruous single development, then that can't be used as a way to avoid things like Section 106 agreements. You then can look at them in the whole, because otherwise that would be a loophole for developers to avoid any contributions for any development. And the developer themselves have kind of explained that future phase as being, they've called it zone 1, and then this is zone 2, 3, 4. They themselves are viewing it as one development. Yes, it's been submitted as 2 separate planning applications, but that doesn't mean they are kind of separate. Is that what you're referring to? Yeah.
I was in a roundabout way saying, wanting to be reassured there isn't a loophole that potentially could be exploited here.
Just clarifying the other application, if you just bear with us 1 minute. Whilst they're just looking that up, Guy, are you happy to answer a listed building question? So I just wanted to clarify from the report, the listed building consent, page 132, paragraph 5.3 onwards. There's several paragraphs that sort of go through and list the various elements of the buildings that are listed and some of the things that are of note within them. And I think the report later on talks about the fact that the plan form of those listed buildings is retained within the development largely. But there are things mentioned like a historic 19th century staircase, which is mentioned in paragraph 5.4. And I wasn't sure whether or not some of those sort of detail elements are retained within the scheme or not.
Hello, just to pick on this as best I can. My colleague Maya specifically handled the detail of the listed building consent applications. And she did make a number of suggested conditions because to a degree, some of the upper parts of the listed buildings aren't fully explored. And so there were various conditions added to make sure that we ascertain what exactly is there and to be in control of the changes. So in terms of staircases and such like, you know, they are as they are on the plan on the lower floors, but anything sort of higher up that we couldn't inspect, I think we've covered that through a condition to find out at a later date.
But I think so. The conditions that I saw, I think, were about recording and documenting, but not necessarily retaining. And I just wasn't sure whether or not. I know overall the conclusion is overall that any harm that's caused is outweighed by the public benefit, and you know, so in that sense, it's very clear. It's just for my own understanding, really, in terms of. I presume that the intention is always to try to retain as much of any listed interiors or any detail as we possibly can, and then there's a balance that's struck between the need for development versus the need to perhaps remove a staircase that may not be functional in or feasible within the plan.
Yes, as I understand it, Maya was content that the overall balance was positive. Certainly, it's quite unusual to be able to get access to all the upper floors and to put them back into positive use. You know, that's been a big issue in the city centre, and it's unusual to have this degree of control now on the condition of the upper floors. So in that sense, we saw it as very positive. You know, the only negative particular thing that we saw was the exposure of the Spurry Gate building as a sort of chop through, because it's a mid-terrace listed building. But certainly on balance, the upper floors of zones 3 and 4 were favourably received.
I'm sorry. To go back to the previous question, we've just checked and it looks like it's 7 residential units proposed in the other planning application. So it's a small amount where we wouldn't necessarily ask for a contribution.
Okay, does that cover the question that was posed? So we've established it's a small development. I think your question was whether or not it should or shouldn't be included within any viability, but I think from what I'm hearing, it's so small that it wouldn't make a material difference.
Yeah, you're right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Councillor Stewart, I had you on my list next.
Thanks, Chair. It's just coming back to the dropping students off at university issue. Now, this committee spent a lot of time discussing it for other applications where we've had no issue with city centre, so we can get to the place no problem, and no issue with the actual access where sites have owned their own access and car park and everything like that. So I thought there might be a bit more discussion. I've got 2 Guildhall and 2 Micklegate councillors here, so maybe it's not a concern. But I appreciate we're going to have a plan for people arriving, but for a normal, you know, site which isn't the city centre, that plan could effectively work through all the hours. You know, here we're obviously limited in terms of most of those hours are gone, and it has to be early or late. So somebody might want to arrive at 11 or 12 or 1 or 2, doesn't make a difference. But you know, you're fundamentally talking about very early or very late. So my question really relates to the fact that, you know, for me, experience would dictate some people are going to want to arrive at times where they just can't access the street, and therefore their drop off will be pull up on Ousegate, tell all of their family to clear out, get everything, and then they'll see them later, or pull up on Lendal, tell all their family to clear out, and then they'll sort of see them later. So could we condition it so that for the non-foot streets or non-foot streets times, the university operator has to have an alternative which involves
people dropping off somewhere away from the site, and then some way of getting the baggage into the site. So I'm sort of visualizing, in my not an expert of this, the sorts of things that hotel porters would use, where you have all the suitcases and everything like that you might see. Is that in any way viable? Because I just think the amount of time we spent on other things where the access is far easier, it does need more thought here than having a plan further down the line when obviously the student accommodation is all built and then we're not going to be able to turn things down.
I don't think it passes any of the tests for being necessary. We can. I don't think we can refuse the development without that arrangement. The foot street hours dictate how the whole of the city centre's serviced. And the development will have to work within those foot street hours like all the other properties in the city centre do. And it reasonably works. I don't see how it affects this development.
Yeah, I don't think that's the fairest answer, if I may say so, because I wasn't advocating refusing the development over this. I was advocating how we conditioned it, and
that's the test for imposing planning conditions.
Well, I think there's a lot of aspects of conditions that you could say that wouldn't be enough to refuse the application based on a particular wording, a particular condition. It's quite a high bar for every condition if it's a make or break on that one aspect alone.
Well, I mean, we can ask Sandra to come in on this point, but what the advice that we're given is that conditions have got to obviously have certain elements that they've got to comply with, and we don't think what you're requesting would be reasonable. And that's the advice that we're giving as officers. We're not saying you're going to refuse it because of it, but what we're saying is, given the limitations of the site and where it sits, that we don't think what you're requesting is reasonable as a condition. Yeah.
I mean, yeah, I think for clarity, if I have remembered this correctly, any condition, whatever it is, has to be reasonable, proportionate, and enforceable. And so I guess that the tests here would be: is it reasonable in terms of the development? Is it proportionate to the perceived problem? And is it enforceable? Oh, and necessary as well. Yeah. Councillor Fisher.
I would be grateful if somebody could tell me the difference then between having a management plan on this site and the management plan we imposed on the site where the tyre is on Layerthorpe, the old tyre factory. We had imposed a management plan for people getting in and out at the start of term there. I believe we did on the site where the Mecca Bingo was as well. You know, we have imposed these in the past, and they are necessary in many cases to get students in and out efficiently. And this is a particularly difficult site because, you know, students don't just come with a suitcase, they come with lots and lots of stuff now, and actually getting them in there is going to be a real challenge here, and then it needs to be managed, otherwise we'll have carnage in around Lendl, Lewis Gate and so on.
So I think from my position from the chair, you know, we as a committee can have a think about, based on the advice from the officers, about whether or not we think it meets any of those tests, and if we feel that it doesn't, it's reasonable and all of those things, we can, as I say, taking into account any advice, we can act accordingly. The one thing that I would say that's different about those sites that you mentioned, because I also had the Layerthorpe one in particular in mind, I think there part of the issue was that we were concerned that traffic backing up onto the inner ring road would have a huge impact potentially on the whole city. I suppose that some of what the officers are saying to us here is that this location, this site is different because there are already quite considerable traffic restrictions in terms of accessibility, and outside of those times it's probably not a high traffic area in terms of through traffic or you know, traffic that might be needing to get past or through the site. As I say, I'm not necessarily advocating one way or the other. It's something that the committee wants to consider based on the advice that we've had, and perhaps when we do come to the point of debate, determination, if people want to revisit that and have that discussion, I'm happy to have that discussion. Okay, I'm looking for any further questions for officers at this moment. I'm just checking on my own notes to make sure I've asked the things that I needed to ask. Okay, I don't have further questions. I'm not seeing any further indications from members. So I can, in that case, move us into debate. So I'll just remind everybody this is the opportunity to thrash out any of those sorts of issues like the one we're just mentioning, and also give any indication of your thoughts on the application as a whole. I'm not seeking any proposals at this stage, and I will just remind you all that if somebody has just spoken at length and given lots of really good points, just it's fine to say I agree with them. You don't need to repeat all of those points again. But Councillor Whitcroft, I've seen you first.
Thank you, Chair. I was biting my tongue throughout the discussion around the access, the car access questions, because I didn't want to turn it into debate without the debate section being through. I will come to that. I'm broadly in favour of this application. I think it's a fantastic use of unused space, providing a new river frontage, much needed in that part of the city. I think it is the right place for student accommodation. I will just come on to that, but also for new retail as well. Now, regarding the car issue, and this gave me flashbacks to my first ever planning committee, where we discussed, as Councillor Fisher brought up, the former tyre fit place that's become student accommodation. I thought in that instance, it was the expectation being placed by the applicant and the management company that students would arrive by car. My view, knowing this site as I do, I live very nearby, and having seen it, I thought that the view would be from the management company or from whoever that students at the start of term or whenever being dropped off would be done so via a different method than just as you were saying, parking on Lendl or Ousegate. I think you would have to be a bit mad to want to have to park on Lendl and Ousegate in order to drop off your children for university or whoever it may be. I'm sure that the university will be looking at other public transport methods, shuttle buses, telling people in advance there is no parking, do not drive into the city centre to try and drop off. And if we want to use space for student accommodation that I think is massively fitting for students, we're going to have to accept that limitation. But this brings me on to sort of the main point of why I'm pleased about it. Helmsley Group have shown that they are fantastic at engagement. They've had 2 different commendations and approvals from 2 different organisations. Flick Williams is someone who is massively passionate about disability rights and will always be holding people to account. To get her approval and condemnation is no mean feat whatsoever. And they've already said that they'll make sure that keeps going, that the engagement is a process, not a destination. So I think we can continue to engage them as a council, as and when we need to. I'm sure they'll be open to that. I do understand the use cases discussion as well, but I think it's important to stay within the remit of the committee. And just on safety at the end to finish off, I think that I was actually satisfied. I know I asked a lot of questions about river safety. It's something I'm very passionate about, representing a riverside ward. I'm satisfied with the informative that we've discussed around making sure that there are safety devices attached along the river. Just on the issue you raised, Councillor Stewart, it's a good point about you wouldn't want to haul someone up however many metres it is. That is just the case for most of the city centre, unfortunately. We've got high sides to our river. It is the advice, I think, of the RNLI and other water authorities that if you are in the water in that scenario, you try and float, don't swim to the edge and try and clamber up, float your way down. And in this case, you'll float your way down to Fishergate Ward, where everything is always much better. One of my heroic residents will dive into the river and save you in a place where it's easier to access the river. So all my questions have been satisfied. Very pleased with what we've seen, and I'm broadly in favour. Thank you.
Okay, next I had Councillor Melly. I've then got Councillor Fenton and Councillor Stewart, and I think Councillor Eyre as well.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I've had fewer questions about this application than I usually have about applications of this scale at Planning Committee, and that is partly down to officers. I think the information in the report is good, but also it's because the applicant has been so good at sharing information, consulting, that sort of thing, that I've come to this meeting feeling like I'm very well informed about these plans and all my questions have been answered. Most of my questions have been answered. That being said, I don't think it's a perfect application or perfect design. I do have concerns about when residents are moving in and out. We're talking about 700 or more people moving out or in a very short space of time, potentially a week, potentially a weekend. And yes, when there have been other applications for purpose-built student accommodation, I have absolutely supported there being conditions about the management to manage that. I don't think it's practical in this case because we're not talking about people parking up or dropping off immediately outside or on the applicant's, the site of the application. We're talking about such a big radius here, 300 metres, 400 metres, 500 metres from the site. I don't think it's reasonable to expect future management of this site to manage what people are doing so far away. It's just not practical. And other aspects, the other benefits of this application are so great that concern about highways, concerns about dropping off and moving in and out isn't great enough at all for it to tip the planning balance. I also have concerns about the amount of open space and green space, because there is some on site, and having any on site in such a city centre location is better than a lot of other applicants do. But I don't feel like it's enough. I think open space, especially green open space, is really important for the mental health and physical health of future residents. And I don't think there's enough on site, and I don't think there's enough nearby either, because it is such a city centre location. But again, not enough to tip the planning balance to support refusal. And then the other point I wanted to make was about the discussions about accessibility and blue badge parking. Because yes, usually if we were looking at an application for 350, whatever it is, dwellings, I would absolutely expect to see many more blue badge parking spaces than 2. But this application overall is accessible by design. Almost every single aspect of this application is accessible. The inaccessible issue of vehicle access for people who absolutely need it isn't to do with this applicant. It's to do with restrictions placed by the council, not the applicant. And I think it's 5% or 7% of the rooms being accessible is appropriate for the demographic of future residents. I think it's obviously there are people for whom public transport isn't accessible or is inaccessible, or the 300 metres you have to travel to reach the public transport isn't accessible, and those people likely need vehicle access to their home in order to be able to access their home. But I think those people are probably quite unlikely to choose to live somewhere that they can't get in or out of and can't access during the day, all day, every day. There may be some people who choose to live there because they can't find anywhere else to live, or because that's where their friends are living and they want to live there, and so too, or people might visit in the evening when there is vehicle access, and I think 2 blue badge spaces is adequate for that purpose.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Fenton was next.
Thank you, Chair. I think Coney Street is a street I think everyone cares about and has a view on, and can think of ways in which it can be improved. And it's really good to see a vision such as this come forward. Yes, it's not perfect. I think we've teased out in the discussion some real concerns in terms of loss of some facilities, which I wouldn't discount as it's just retail. In terms of pharmacy provision, boot stores have already closed in Clifton and in Heworth, so we're now looking at the loss of a city centre pharmacy, and the mantra in the NHS is pharmacy first. Well, it's pretty difficult if there isn't one. But I do hope, and I have faith that alternative sites will be found. And in terms of post office site, it may be in a more accessible location. So I think these are concerns, but they're not insurmountable. I think there's a broader concern around contribution towards primary health services in terms of GP capacity, but as we've heard, the viability assessment on this application kind of makes that a redundant debate, but it's one that I think we will keep coming back to, because there are a whole range of reasons why a viability assessment may suggest no contributions are needed. The demand doesn't go away, and this is more of a kind of a planning system issue, which in planning reforms, when they come along, it may be addressed, because we're storing up issues here, and it would be unfair to put these all on the shoulders of this one application, because that would be inappropriate. I was sort of thinking back to kind of the 2 Roman Quarter debates that we had when that came to planning, and thinking of the kind of heated debates we had there around provision of affordable housing or provision of a commuted sum. The 2 sites aren't comparable in terms of student flats. This does meet an identified need, and I think we should we should take that into serious consideration. But it does concern me that it's another opportunity to provide affordable accommodation in an accessible city centre location where we know a lot of people work and are unable to live. But we have to consider the application that is before us. We may wish it to be something else or have a more diverse mix of tenure types, which is why I asked the question of the applicants whether they had considered that. But they gave I think a reasonable explanation in terms of, in order to keep the historic floor plate of the buildings, it lent itself to more smaller accommodation that wouldn't lend itself to a 2 or 3 bed sort of family home. So yeah, it's an application that clearly has merit, and yeah, thinking about it.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Stewart.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I mean, I remain confused about the issue of the access and the ability to have a site plan, and the amount of time we spent discussing other university drop-offs compared to this one, where I think it'll be far more of an issue here. But I've said my bit on that. And in terms of, I hate to disagree with Councillor Melly, and I rarely see the need. But just because something's 200 metres away from a site, it doesn't affect the need for it to be considered. If you're building a sports facility, you might conceivably be looking at things several miles away in terms of the impact they could have. In terms of what Councillor Whitcroft has said about the doing well on disabled access and everything like that, I think really well done to Helmsley. It is a great York company, has done really well. But equally, I'd probably be I would praise Helmsley, but I'd be keen to kick all the other developers that don't get to this sort of standard. And for a developer to be praised on listening to answer in a consultation shouldn't be rocket science, and it's incredible so many fail on that. So, but well done. Look, I think it's a really positive development. I think it's a really good application. We all love York and we think York's a great place, but that's for things like the Minster, the Museum Gardens, the Castle Museum, the city walls. If you go around places like Coney Street, in truth, it's often pretty grotty. And you look down, it's a bit grotty. You look up, it's a bit grotty. We've got so many empty shops and we've got real issues. So a developer actually grabbing hold of some of these issues and putting money into it for what I think will be a massively improved area. This can only be positive. So much of the centre of York is now just used for people sort of turning up and everything like this. This will be a real destination to come to. And so in aggregate of the application, I think very positive overall.
Thank you. I'm just going to allow Councillor Melly just to clarify the point that she was making, because I think she feels that you've slightly misunderstood it. So
yeah, I hope don't mind clarifying. I do think that there will be a huge impact, a huge negative impact of such a huge number of people moving in and out all at once, and that will have a huge impact on the highways network and cause obstructions and all sorts. My point really was that there's several things that conditions have to be. They have to be, you listed them, necessary and reasonable and proportionate. I think it would be necessary and proportionate to have some sort of management plan about that, but not reasonable. I think it's reasonable to expect future management of a site to try to control what happens on their premises or adjacent to their premises, but hundreds of meters away. I don't see how it'd be practical to have any control over so many highways over such a large area. When a car pulls up and stops, how do you know if that's a tourist getting out with a suitcase, or if it's a student moving into accommodation 500 meters away? Or it's more about the reasonableness test rather than the impact of it or anything like that. That's all I meant.
okay, thank you. Councillor Eyre, I had you next.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, it's one of the most conflicted applications I think I've had as I've looked through this one. I've obviously always been supportive of the principle of what's happening on Coney Street. The York City Beautiful paper that came out ages ago has always made big things about the fact that we don't make the most of the river in this city and seek every opportunity to maximise that, which obviously this is part of. And again, we've talked for a long time, decades in fact, about how we start to reanimate Coney Street and more significantly make better use of those spaces above shops, which are redundant. I mean, I've walked around quite a few of them when I was an exec member, and there's some very strange and beautiful properties all around there, but it is primarily redundant and a bit like a sort of a miniature ghost town across the middle of the city centre. I was obviously disappointed. There was lots of reference to the loss of Boots, but for me, it's always will be Woolworths. And I was very disappointed to find out that the Woolworths frontage, it was not a particularly listed building in the city. It's one of the most iconic things, the pick and mix at Woolworths at the end of Coney Street, for those of you a little bit older, but it was never listed. Therefore, I can't take that one into consideration. Personally, I think I do reflect on the comments from the Council for British Archaeology. I think that does sort of sit where I am in terms of what I think. Their view that it is an unjustified level of harm, which could be reduced by creating a less intensive mix of residential uses on the upper floors. The viability of this compared to less impactful strategies of future residential use should be established to justify the level of harm. I would have much rather that had happened and those assessments had been done. Looking at the potential benefits, because the one thing we've not discovered in terms of discussing this is that it actually is less than substantial harm, and we should be weighing that less than substantial harm against the positive benefits, which I don't think we've really done as a committee. Those benefits, we see the Riverside Walkway I mentioned, absolutely integrally, absolutely vital. This has huge issues in terms of that. There is one particular piece of that Riverside Walkway, as we discussed, which is not on this application site, so it's actually proposing two separate Riverside walkways that are unconnected, and absolutely no guarantee that does become a Riverside Walkway. It could be two cul-de-sacs with a lot of issues actually about what the circulation is around that, how people get in and out. And part of that walkway actually is still owned by the City of York Council, and that's not in this particular plan, so that is not even in the gift. So it's unclear what the actual benefit of that Riverside Walkway will be. I raised a question about economic value. The comment we made about new retail, that there isn't really any new retail. There's a massive reduction in a retail space is what's actually proposed, and a shift of retail from retail to leisure usage. Whether that is actually beneficial, that's difficult to say. Again, our economics team haven't provided much detail in the paper. The papers weren't available online for us to read, so we're not able to really assess what that economic benefit would be. Personally, that's my own personal opinion. I think the mix of uses would probably be a better use around that, but that's not my level of expertise. Clearly in the paper as well, officers have flagged the issue that retailers want larger retail units than are being proposed, and I know the particular mix couldn't be referenced, but what could be referenced in is actually the need for large units, because that is one of the issues in the paper. And I think it was suggested that we lose 3 of the large units and get 1 back in terms of that. And the suggestion those 2 large units may be able to find place elsewhere in the city centre, but that isn't necessarily convinced. So we may be leading to a loss of retail floor plates that we actually need in the city. Again, that's not covered in the report. I'm not surprised to say significant issues around the fact that we're not providing any affordable housing at all in favour of ensuring developers and landowners make maximum amounts of profit. And I know we talk about viability as if it's a tipping point between the scheme happening and not happening. What we're talking about in terms of viability includes 15% profit on a £100 million scheme. It's the difference between 15 million and 14 million pound in profit, and probably about £500,000 to £1 million in the pockets of the various landowners around there. So it is feasible, and I think if you look at the viability studies that are there, it is very sceptical about what's proposed, and that's why we do have quite an unusual paragraph in page 61, which basically says, I don't really believe their viability in terms of this. So what we're going to do is keep track of them, keep an eye on them. Lots of information that wasn't supplied is in the fact the FBA says that they declined to provide lots of information that our independent valuer wanted to receive to be able to make an informed decision. They wouldn't give that to them. So it is very sceptical in terms of what that is and the lack of affordability. So the watching brief, I find that really difficult to approve this on the basis that we're going to try and keep an eye on them as the scheme develops in terms of what they use. I'm not remotely convinced. I take a board councillor Whitcock's point. I think if I was a student, I would love to live at the top of Coney Street. I can see certain benefits for that, but I'm not convinced with a lot of the issues that is the right use for this particular site. Set aside against housing, for example, or anything else. Those issues that we're talking about, and appreciate we haven't had conditions like this before, but we've never approved a 358 bed student unit inside the city foot streets before. This is unique, and it's really frustrating that the highways department didn't pick up on any of this or give us anything to work on this report, that actually approving 358 residential units inside the foot streets with a particular pattern and mode of transport is hugely significant, and we should have had more information around that. That window of opportunity to get in there, we're talking about, because I'm sure we're not going to allow people to turn up at 6 o'clock in the morning because of the affinity of everybody else on that site. You're talking about two hours a day, I would imagine, to try and get 358 people in. And I'll take your point about how could you tell whether it's a resident or a tourist. they won't be carrying one suitcase, they'll be carrying 4, possibly 5 suitcases. There'll be 4 or 5 of them in a queue. They're packing their lives in there. As was alluded to by the applicant, they encourage people to stay for 51 weeks. It's a significant shift of equipment and things to get into that particular building. As I say, I've just done it in October. We took a long wheelbase van and the second car because we couldn't get all of the stuff that we needed in, and we were able to do that with about a 80-meter walk. The thought of trying to do that outside the foot street hours, where we also have access barriers, by the way, so they could get in at 10 o'clock. They'll then find it very surprising at 10:32 to find that they can't get out of those foot street hours because automatic bollards have come across, and they will then be having to try and get in touch with our security staff to let them out of that, or you will have people wandering around the foot street zones, wondering how on earth they get out. Do have concerns about zone 1. As my final point, I think, why would you not include zone 1? It doesn't make any sense. You've got zones 1, 2, 3, and 4, and you bring forward an application that doesn't include zone 1. There has to be a reason for that, and I subsequently feel that is about the financial viability. That had zone 1 been included, that viability would have required affordable housing. So it was the process of excluding zone 1, bring that forward as a separate application. That way there will be no affordable on zone 1 and no affordable on zones 2, 3, and 4. I can't see any other reason why you would have a 4-zone thing that you bring forward as 2 separate applications. So generally quite sceptical, Chair.
Thank you. Councillor Fisher.
Thank you. I'll start with the negative. Well, I would have liked to see some more residential on here. Back in the 90s, there was this very big successful scheme called Living Over the Shop, which was designed to get people living back in the upper stories of disused buildings to get residential accommodation and bring life back to town and city centres. And it was a good scheme and it worked. I really think we could have done with some residential accommodation for our permanent city residents on it. I'm also aware for many years at university that water and students can be an extremely potent and sometimes sadly a very tragic mix. York University Lake, which I've ended up in a few times, mostly accidentally, is very different from getting out of the Ouse. There has to be full safety measures, including life buoys. I appreciate 1.1 metres is a reasonable height for the railings, but I think that could be got over quite easily if somebody was drunk and determined. So I think we need to just make sure that when this scheme is implemented, if it is, that we look at this, review the safety of the system and make sure that there are suitable measures in place to keep people safe. Now we come to the positives. The scheme is very well thought out. I think architecturally it's vastly superior to what's there now. It'll be a huge benefit for York. The enhancement of the public realm is incredibly welcome, and it will totally rejuvenate the riverside. I've always felt since I came to York that a complete riverside walk from Lowes Gate right down to Lendl would be a wonderful thing. Unfortunately, some very inconsiderate medieval architects took the Guildhall complex there, which rather kiboshes that one, but this is a good start for getting some access. The other thing, it will also provide a lot more shopping along the riverbank, which will be, a great place to go and some leisure as well. When residents, friends of mine, come to stay in York, they usually praise the city for many reasons. But the one street they normally have a gripe about is Coney Street. It's dated and it isn't really suitable for the main flagship shopping centre of York. I think this will restore that. I'm broadly in favour of it and I probably will support it.
Okay, Councillor Melly, I think you wanted to come back. I'm just going to see if anybody else wanted to make any other comments as well. No, I'll bring it up.
I disagree about this being a suitable location for any other sort of housing other than student housing. I think it's a suitable location for student housing and wouldn't be a suitable location for any other sort of dwelling, C3 dwelling house. And I believe there have been applications for in the immediate vicinity of this application for that space above retail to be turned into flats, and that's been refused recently because of, well, I think primarily noise and public protection objecting on the basis of noise, especially at night. There's a lot of venues nearby. I kind of don't want to name names, but on this same street, there's Yates's and Vodka Revs, and then also at night, it's a main thoroughfare for people walking between kind of New Lane and the venues on there and through down to kind of Rouge Street and the clubs and stuff down there. It's very, very noisy at night. And for that reason, our own planning department have said that it's not a suitable location for housing. Whereas I think being able to bring this space back into use for something that it is suitable for is, you know, student housing is the obvious solution to that. And not only that, but if there is a need for more purpose-built student accommodation, I'm not sure we've actually seen evidence of that, but if there is, then city centre is a more suitable location than residential areas where residents in those residential areas also complain about noise caused by students. So not only do I think this is a suitable location for student accommodation, I think it's more suitable than other locations.
Okay, Councillor A, you wanted to add something?
Yeah, I think just on that point, I don't agree with that. I think we should always be pushing for mixed communities, and we do seem to be having a process here in York of driving all residential property out of the city centre, and I don't think that is the right place. I also don't think students should have less protection from noise amenity than any other resident. Everybody has the same protections, and that suggestion that, well, students can put up with 2 AM revellers, but residents can't, isn't an argument that isn't an argument we should be using. We should have mixed communities, and we should be using our planning system to make sure we have students and residents living hand in hand and not separating the two apart.
Okay, I'm just going to make a couple of observations myself. I think from my perspective, you know, these are a number of listed buildings, and I think it's very positive the way that the buildings are being brought back into use and respecting the previous use of those buildings. I do, there's a bit of me that does think, will we at some point regret the loss of the W.H. Smith sort of brutalist architecture in the same way that I'm probably one of the few people in York to regret the demolition of Hudson House, which I personally thought was beautiful, but you know, everybody has their own different tastes, don't they? I think for me in this application, the big issue really is around the affordable housing contribution or lack thereof. I did seek clarification from officers in advance of the meeting around you know, how robust was the mechanism going to be, how sort of happy were they as a planning authority, so that I could assure us as a committee. And I think, you know, reached a point where actually I felt that all that could be done was being done in terms of making sure that there is sufficient process when it comes to the 106 agreement to ensure that there is suitable mechanisms at appropriate points, that if that 15% threshold is exceeded, York is, you know, doesn't lose out from that respect. So I think, you know, that is, it is what it is, and I think that it as much has been done as can be done. That would be where I feel I am on it. And I think, you know, those comments that have been made around whether or not it should be housing of a different type or otherwise. My own personal view, having been a student in Edinburgh, having lived above retail units in the city centre, and then subsequently lived in more residential areas, actually, I think as a student, my experience was better in the city centre above retail units than it was in the outer areas in amongst people who wanted to live in the daytime when I, as a student, wanted to live in the nighttime. And so actually, for my money, having this city centre location is not just good for the buildings and space, but it's actually good for the students that will be attracted to come to live in York and will add vibrancy to the city centre. And that supports all manner of different types of businesses. And I think actually becomes quite complementary to the way that the city works as a whole. There are a number of positives within the report that I think we've kind of as a committee just skirted over, and I think they are important things just to acknowledge and recognise as well. You know, the improved views looking from the other riverbank over to this site, I think that will become apparent as the site is built out, as you come across Ouse Bridge in particular. I think that the view that you get from there will be greatly enhanced. There's quite a number of biodiversity increases that are identified throughout the report. And all of the retail, as I understand from the report, will meet BREEAM Excellent, which again is something that's really positive. Personally, I think the reinstatement of the historic shop fronts along Coney Street, again, will be a real positive overall when this scheme is fully delivered. And I think, you know, it's been mentioned already, but I think it is worth reiterating a final time. You know, that the fact that we all know that commentators like Flick Williams do hold our feet to the fire repeatedly on issues of access, and notwithstanding some of the concerns that Councillor Burton rightly raised around different types of provision within the site, I think the fact that Ms Williams felt compelled to come and speak praising the approach that was taken by this applicant and this developer, it does set a bar for all of the other developers in the city, because actually it makes our job a lot easier when we're being told by people who are passionate campaigners and you know, indeed experts in their area, that this is actually something which may not be perfect, but is a damn sight better than a lot of things that we've seen. You know, I think that to my mind, you know, is noteworthy and you know, as I say, bears repeating again. So I think all those things considered, you know, it gives you an indication of where I am on this scheme, which you know, I think finance notwithstanding, I think is long overdue in many respects. So long, in fact, that I was mentioning earlier that in primary school in York, we did a project about a bridge along the River Ouse, between the Ouse Bridge and Lendal Bridge. That was when I was 10. So not quite 11 years ago. No, best part of 40 years ago. So yeah, for my money, this is a really positive thing for York to see this happening, and I hope that it's developed out over you know, a quick period of time, assuming that everybody else on the committee is in the same place that I am. With that in mind, obviously the next step is to consider the officer recommendation. We are considering the two different elements, so we're looking at both the major application and then the listed building consent, both of which are recommended for approval subject to Secretary of State. So I'm looking first of all for a proposal to consider those applications. I saw Councillor Whitcraft's hand marginally before I saw Councillor Melly's, so
Propose that we accept the officer recommendation. Thank you, Chair.
Councillor Melly.
Yeah, for the major application, can I second that? But there was a proposal to just slightly modify the wording on the conditions about the landscape plan to make sure it's clear that it's in perpetuity, because that was the intention of the condition.
Yeah, I think there was that modification. There was also the informative around river safety, which I think was in the same condition actually as well. So assuming that I'm seeing nods that everybody's happy with those two minor amendments. So proposed and seconded. Becky, can I invite you just to tell us what we are going to vote on, and then I will be taking the votes.
Firstly, the full planning application with the amended condition as outlined in your additional information, and the amendment to the landscaping condition. So that's for the full. And then the listed building application as per the committee report and the conditions in there. Thank you.
Okay, so taking the major full application first. Sorry.
When I seconded, I did say that I was seconding the full major application, but I'm happy to second both. Just in case anyone caught on the microphone that I'd specified.
Yeah. Thank you. So you're happy to second both. So first of all, then taking the major full application. So can I see by show of hands all those in favour of approval? And anybody wishing to refuse? Sorry, vote against. My apologies. All those against approval? Okay, one against, and any abstentions? Okay, so with one abstention, one against, and 9 for, that is approved. So then moving to the listed building consent, same again then, if I can see by show of hands, all those in favour of approval. And anybody against approval? And any abstentions? Okay, so with 2 abstentions and 9 in favour, that is also approved. So that means that planning permission is granted and listed building consent is granted on that application. There's no other business in this evening's meeting, so thank you all for your time today, and that concludes today's meeting.